My name is Diana Ford. I am 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat in a freezing Portland boardroom and watched my father slide a heavy gold pen across a mahogany table. He pointed to a dotted line on a legal document and told me to sign away my right to exist in our family. My mother sat beside him, checking her diamond watch, while my brother smirked, already planning how to spend the $6 million estate that was going entirely to him. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was the same silent girl who always swallowed their insults to keep the peace. But the man they were trying to rob had been dead for a month, and he was still about to ruin their lives. Before I tell you how a golden child lost everything and how I fought back, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories, but only if you genuinely connect with this kind of journey. I would love to know your age, where you are listening from, and what time it is right now. Drop it in the comments. Now let me take you into that boardroom. The rain hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office in sharp, irregular sheets. The room smelled of lemon polish and bitter coffee. I sat at the far end of the long table. My boots were still faintly dusted with dried mud from the Willamette Valley. I had driven 2 hours from my agricultural consulting site to be here. My hands rested in my lap, the skin calloused from years of examining soil health and working the land in the Cascade Range. Across from me sat the people who shared my DNA, but treated me like a disease. My father, Charles, wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He leaned forward, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. My mother, Abigail, wore a beige cashmere sweater. She kept her gaze fixed on the wall just above my head. She always did that, looking near me but never actually at me. It was her signature way of turning me into a ghost. Beside them sat my brother, Nolan. 4 years younger than me, Nolan possessed the kind of effortless charm that only came from a lifetime of hearing the word yes. He ran a tech manufacturing startup that supposedly revolutionized supply chains. My parents funded his seed rounds, bought his coastal property, and paid off his early credit card debts. Next to Nolan sat his wife, Tiffany. She adjusted her designer silk scarf and offered me a smile that held all the warmth of a winter storm. Tiffany liked to pretend we were close in public, but behind closed doors, she viewed my career in sustainable agriculture as a punchline. She viewed my life as a failure because I did not wear designer labels or attend charity galas. Mr. Higgins, the family estate attorney, cleared his throat. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. The document in front of me was titled Waiver of Contest. The stipulations were incredibly simple. Our late father had left his entire $6 million estate to Nolan. Every stock portfolio, the coastal mansion, the liquid cash, all of it. I was excluded from the will. But the legal technicalities required my signature on this waiver to release the funds smoothly. They needed me to legally forfeit my right to challenge the distribution. Without my signature, the probate process would drag on for months, and Nolan would not get a dime until the courts cleared it. They needed me to erase myself. My father did not seem worried that I might refuse. Refusal was not a concept he associated with me. He turned his attention back to Higgins, eager to discuss the only thing he truly cared about, his own status. With the patriarch gone, the holding company board will need restructuring, my father said. He steepled his fingers. My seat on the board is more vital now than ever. The $250,000 annual retainer is a nice perk, but the voting power is what matters. I plan to reshape the executive team by the third quarter. Higgins nodded smoothly. Your influence on the late Theodore Estate Board is well documented, Charles. I watched my father bask in the glow of his own perceived authority. My grandfather, Theodore, had built an empire in Oregon, and my father had spent his entire life coasting on that legacy. He occupied a high-paid board seat while contributing nothing of actual value to the community or the land. He just collected checks and demanded respect. Underneath the table, my hand slipped into the pocket of my canvas jacket. My fingers traced the smooth, familiar grooves of a small piece of carved Oregon white oak. Grandfather Theodore gave it to me a decade ago. We were standing in the pouring rain on my farm. He had watched me work the soil with my bare hands, studying the ecosystem, building something real. He had handed me the carved wood, his rough thumb pressing into my palm. "True wealth has roots, Diana," he had told me, "not just branches." Theodore saw the rot in his own son. He understood the difference between a person who cultivates life and a person who merely extracts it. My father was an extractor. Nolan was an extractor. They measured worth in vanity metrics and bank balances. They did not care about the health of the forests or the sustainability of the farms that made our state thrive. They only cared about what they could take from it. "Diana," my mother snapped. Her voice cut through the memory like a razor. She finally lowered her gaze to look at me. "Do not sit there and stall. You chose your little farming lifestyle. Nolan chose the future of this family. Sign the paper so we can leave." Tiffany sighed loudly, inspecting her manicure. "Diana, please," Tiffany murmured. "We have a dinner reservation in the Pearl District at 7. I know things are tight for you out in the country, but some of us have schedules to keep. Let us not turn a simple signature into a prolonged drama. You can go back to playing in the dirt tomorrow." I looked at the golden pen. It sat there on the dark wood, heavy and expectant. A decade ago, I would have signed it. I would have felt the familiar burning shame in my throat, the desperate urge to please people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. I would have signed away my rights just to earn a single nod of approval from my father. But I was not that girl anymore. I spent years building a life out in the Cascade Range, learning how things grow, learning how to weather storms. I ran my own consulting business. I advised major timber operations on how to harvest without destroying the ecosystem. I had built a reputation based on hard work and integrity. I did not need their money, but I refused to give them my compliance. I looked at my father. I looked at the greed dancing in his eyes. I looked at my brother, who was vibrating with anticipation for his unearned millions. I did not pick up the pen. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table. I let the silence stretch. I let it fill the room until the air felt thick and heavy. My father frowned. His patience was fracturing. "I told you to sign it," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You are holding up the inevitable. Do not make this difficult." I held his gaze. I did not blink. I did not reach for the pen. The air in the boardroom grew tight, every person at the table waiting for me to break. But the break was not going to come from me. The silence in the boardroom stretched thick and suffocating. I kept my hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table. My posture relaxed. I refused to give them the reaction they were starving for. I knew this script. I had lived it for 32 years. The setup, the insult, the expectation of my emotional collapse. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to throw the pen. They wanted me to confirm their narrative that Diana was erratic, difficult, and ultimately unworthy of the family name. Mr. Higgins cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with the standoff. The sudden noise broke the spell. "Let us proceed with the formal reading," he said, his voice returning to its practiced, neutral cadence. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the thick stack of papers. "Last Will and Testament of Richard Ford Higgins, read. dated 18 months ago. The document was dense with legal jargon, but the core of it was brutally simple. My father had amassed a fortune of approximately $6 million. This included a diverse stock portfolio, heavily weighted in tech and pharmaceuticals, a sprawling coastal mansion in Cannon Beach, and substantial liquid assets currently held in multiple trust accounts. Higgins continued reading the distribution clauses. To my son, Nolan Richard Ford, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all real property, financial accounts, and personal effects. My mother smiled. It was a tight, satisfied expression pulling at the corners of her carefully maintained face. She looked at me, her gaze dropping to my scuffed work boots, then up to my canvas jacket. It is for the best, Diana, she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Your mud boots lifestyle out there in the woods, it just does not align with the corporate image your father worked so hard to build. Nolan understands the burden of legacy. You have always been happier playing in the dirt. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I just watched her. My mother viewed my career as an embarrassment. I consulted for artisan farms and sustainable timber operations. I spent my days analyzing soil composition, negotiating selective logging contracts, and helping local landowners implement environmentally sound practices. I earned a comfortable living. I owned a modest cabin in the Cascade Range. I was respected in my field. But to Abigail Ford, if you were not attending charity galas in designer gowns or securing massive corporate deals, you were essentially unemployed. Nolan shifted in his seat, leaning back with an air of profound, unearned confidence. He ran a tech startup that produced software promising to optimize supply chain logistics. At least, that was the pitch. In reality, he spent more time securing venture capital funding and throwing lavish launch parties than actually delivering a working product. But my parents loved the optics of a tech CEO son. They funded his lifestyle, bailed him out of early failures, and paraded him around their social circles as a visionary. Well, look at it this way, Diana Nolan said, steepling his fingers. He wore a smirk that he probably thought looked magnanimous. Cannon Beach is a massive property, 3 acres right on the ocean. The grounds have been neglected since Dad got sick. I am going to need a total overhaul of the landscaping. Tiffany let out a soft, delighted laugh, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Oh, Nolan, that is a wonderful idea, she chimed in. Keep it in the family. Nolan nodded, leaning forward to fix me with a condescending stare. I can hire you, Diana. As a contractor, obviously. I will even pay above market rate for the area. You can clear the brush, handle the soil, whatever it is you do. It would be a nice little project for you, and it keeps you connected to the property. The offer hung in the air, toxic and deliberate. My brother, who was inheriting $6 million, was offering to pay me an hourly wage to pull weeds at our childhood summer home. It was the ultimate power play, the final crushing insult designed to break me down completely. I looked at Nolan. His eyes were wide, waiting for the explosion. I looked at Tiffany, practically vibrating with excitement for the drama. I looked at my mother, her chin raised, victorious. They were a pack of wolves, waiting for the wounded animal to thrash. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I felt the rough edges of the carved Oregon white oak in my pocket. I thought of my grandfather Theodore. I thought of the ancient evergreens swaying in the wind back home. I thought of the deep, rich soil that sustained life long after superficial things withered and died. I pulled my hand from my pocket and placed it flat on the table again. That is a generous offer, Nolan, I said, my voice steady, betraying absolutely zero emotion. But I am currently fully booked with clients who understand the value of my time. You will have to find someone else to clear your brush. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't expectant. It was confused. My refusal to engage with their cruelty short-circuited their plan. I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't given them the satisfaction of a scene. I had simply declined a landscaping job. Nolan's smirk faltered. A flash of genuine irritation crossed his face. He hated being dismissed, especially by me. "Fine," he snapped, his magnanimous facade cracking. "Your loss." Mr. Higgins cleared his throat, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "If we can return to the matter at hand," he said, tapping the waiver of contest with his index finger. "The distribution of the estate is contingent upon all potential heirs signing this document, waiving any right to challenge the will in probate court. Diana, your signature is required to finalize the transfer of assets to Nolan." My father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since demanding I sign the waiver earlier, finally spoke up. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "We are done playing games, Diana," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You heard the will. You know where you stand. We have indulged your rebellion for long enough. Sign the paper. Erase yourself from this process so we can handle the real business." He slid the document closer to me. The golden pen gleamed, mocking me. They had orchestrated this entire afternoon to corner me. They had invited me here not to mourn, not to share, but to ensure I witnessed my own disinheritance and then forced me to legally validate it. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I looked down at the dotted line beneath my printed name. Signing this paper meant agreeing with them. It meant legally acknowledging that I was worth nothing, that I deserved nothing, that I was a mistake they were finally correcting. My mother tapped her watch again. "We really do have reservations, Charles," she murmured, aiming her annoyance at my father now. I reached out. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal barrel of the golden pen. I felt the weight of it. I pulled the document toward me. Nolan let out a long breath, slumping back in his chair in relief. Tiffany smiled, already reaching for her designer handbag. My father nodded, satisfied that order was being restored. The prodigal daughter was finally submitting. The script was playing out exactly as they had written it. I positioned the pen over the paper. I felt the familiar, suffocating pressure of my family's expectations pushing down on me, demanding compliance, demanding silence. I pressed the tip of the pen against the thick parchment. But before the ink could form the first letter of my name, a sharp, heavy knock echoed through the room. The sound was abrupt, startling. Everyone froze. My father frowned, turning his head toward the entrance. Mr. Higgins looked up, confusion plain on his face. We had the conference room reserved for the entire afternoon. Interruptions were not permitted. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom did not wait for an invitation. They swung open with a decisive, commanding force. The hinges groaned slightly, a sound that seemed incredibly loud in the sudden, tense silence of the room. The script was about to be rewritten. My name is Diana Ford. I am 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat in a freezing Portland boardroom and watched my father slide a heavy gold pen across a mahogany table. He pointed to a dotted line on a legal document and told me to sign away my right to exist in our family. My mother sat beside him, checking her diamond watch, while my brother smirked, already planning how to spend the $6 million estate that was going entirely to him. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was the same silent girl who always swallowed their insults to keep the peace. But the man they were trying to rob had been dead for a month, and he was still about to ruin their lives. Before I tell you how a golden child lost everything and how I fought back, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories, but only if you genuinely connect with this kind of journey. I would love to know your age, where you are listening from, and what time it is right now. Drop it in the comments. Now let me take you into that boardroom. The rain hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office in sharp, irregular sheets. The room smelled of lemon polish and bitter coffee. I sat at the far end of the long table. My boots were still faintly dusted with dried mud from the Willamette Valley. I had driven 2 hours from my agricultural consulting site to be here. My hands rested in my lap, the skin calloused from years of examining soil health and working the land in the Cascade Range. Across from me sat the people who shared my DNA, but treated me like a disease. My father Charles wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He leaned forward, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. My mother Abigail wore a beige cashmere sweater. She kept her gaze fixed on the wall just above my head. She always did that, looking near me but never actually at me. It was her signature way of turning me into a ghost. Beside them sat my brother Nolan. 4 years younger than me, Nolan possessed the kind of effortless charm that only came from a lifetime of hearing the word yes. He ran a tech manufacturing startup that supposedly revolutionized supply chains. My parents funded his seed rounds, bought his coastal property, and paid off his early credit card debts. Next to Nolan sat his wife, Tiffany. She adjusted her designer silk scarf and offered me a smile that held all the warmth of a winter storm. Tiffany liked to pretend we were close in public, but behind closed doors, she viewed my career in sustainable agriculture as a punchline. She viewed my life as a failure because I did not wear designer labels or attend charity galas. Mr. Higgins, the family estate attorney, cleared his throat. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. The document in front of me was titled, Waiver of Contest. The stipulations were incredibly simple. Our late father had left his entire $6 million estate to Nolan. Every stock portfolio, the coastal mansion, the liquid cash. All of it. I was excluded from the will. But the legal technicalities required my signature on this waiver to release the funds smoothly. They needed me to legally forfeit my right to challenge the distribution. Without my signature, the probate process would drag on for months, and Nolan would not get a dime until the courts cleared it. They needed me to erase myself. My father did not seem worried that I might refuse. Refusal was not a concept he associated with me. He turned his attention back to Higgins, eager to discuss the only thing he truly cared about: his own status. With the patriarch gone, the holding company board will need restructuring, my father said. He steepled his fingers. My seat on the board is more vital now than ever. The $250,000 annual retainer is a nice perk, but the voting power is what matters. I plan to reshape the executive team by the third quarter. Higgins nodded smoothly. Your influence on the late Theodore Estate Board is well documented, Charles. I watched my father bask in the glow of his own perceived authority. My grandfather Theodore had built an empire in Oregon, and my father had spent his entire life coasting that legacy. He occupied a high-paid board seat while contributing nothing of actual value to the community or the land. He just collected checks and demanded respect. Underneath the table, my hand slipped into the pocket of my canvas jacket. My fingers traced the smooth, familiar grooves of a small piece of carved Oregon white oak. Grandfather Theodore gave it to me a decade ago. We were standing in the pouring rain on my farm. He had watched me work the soil with my bare hands, studying the ecosystem, building something real. He had handed me the carved wood, his rough thumb pressing into my palm. True wealth has roots, Diana, he had told me, not just branches. Theodore saw the rot in his own son. He understood the difference between a person who cultivates life and a person who merely extracts it. My father was an extractor. Nolan was an extractor. They measured worth in vanity metrics and bank balances. They did not care about the health of the forests or the sustainability of the farms that made our state thrive. They only cared about what they could take from it. Diana, my mother snapped. Her voice cut through the memory like a razor. She finally lowered her gaze to look at me. Do not sit there and stall. You chose your little farming lifestyle. Nolan chose the future of this family. Sign the paper so we can leave. Tiffany sighed loudly, inspecting her manicure. Diana, please, Tiffany murmured. We have a dinner reservation in the Pearl District at 7. I know things are tight for you out in the country, but some of us have schedules to keep. Let us not turn a simple signature into a prolonged drama. You can go back to playing in the dirt tomorrow. I looked at the golden pen. It sat there on the dark wood, heavy and expectant. A decade ago, I would have signed it. I would have felt the familiar burning shame in my throat, the desperate urge to please people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. I would have signed away my rights just to earn a single nod of approval from my father. But I was not that girl anymore. I spent years building a life out in the Cascade Range, learning how things grow, learning how to weather storms. I ran my own consulting business. I advised major timber operations on how to harvest without destroying the ecosystem. I had built a reputation based on hard work and integrity. I did not need their money, but I refused to give them my compliance. I looked at my father. I looked at the greed dancing in his eyes. I looked at my brother who was vibrating with anticipation for his unearned millions. I did not pick up the pen. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table. I let the silence stretch. I let it fill the room until the air felt thick and heavy. My father frowned. His patience was fracturing. I told you to sign it, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. You are holding up the inevitable. Do not make this difficult. I held his gaze. I did not blink. I did not reach for the pen. The air in the boardroom grew tight, every person at the table waiting for me to break. But the break was not going to come from me. The heavy oak doors did not just open. They yielded. The brass handles turned with a heavy metallic click, and the thick wood swung inward, pulling a rush of cold corridor air into the stagnant heat of the boardroom. My father dropped his hand from the table, his face flushing with instant outrage. Mr. Higgins half rose from his leather chair, his mouth open to bark a reprimand at whatever careless secretary had breached his fortress. But it was not a secretary. The man who stepped over the threshold wore a tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet generation-spanning money. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked older than I was. His silver hair was swept back, and his eyes, a pale, piercing gray, locked onto my father with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a diseased organ. Charles, the man said. His voice was not loud, yet it commanded the space instantly, echoing off the mahogany panels. My father blinked, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second before he scrambled to rebuild it. Arthur Caldwell, my father replied, his tone laced with forced superiority. This is a closed family proceeding. We are finalizing my father's estate. You have no business here. Caldwell did not retreat. He walked further into the room, his leather shoes silent on the thick carpet. He ignored Nolan, who was staring at him like a confused child, and he ignored Tiffany, who had frozen with her designer handbag halfway to her shoulder. Caldwell stopped at the end of the table directly opposite Higgins. You are finalizing the estate of Richard Ford? Caldwell corrected, his tone smooth as polished glass. I am here because I represent the estate of Theodore Ford. Higgins adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking flustered. Mr. Caldwell Theodore Ford passed away 6 months ago. His primary holding company and liquid assets were already transitioned. Charles sits on the board. The probate is closed. Caldwell set his battered briefcase on the pristine table. The primary estate, yes, he murmured, but not the entirety of his legacy. Hearing my grandfather mentioned in this sterile room felt like a shock of cold water. Theodore Ford. The name alone carried a weight my father could never hope to mimic. My mind snapped back 10 years to a bitter, rain-soaked afternoon in the Willamette Valley. I was 22, fresh out of college, sinking every penny I had into my first sustainable agriculture project. The Oregon rain was relentless that day, turning the earth into unforgiving clay. I was on my knees in the dirt, my hands cracked and bleeding from planting cover crops, fighting to stabilize the topsoil before the winter freeze. My father had come to visit, dragging my grandfather along. Charles stood on the edge of the field holding a golf umbrella, his face twisted in profound disgust. I can still hear his voice cutting through the driving rain. "Look at her," Dad Charles had sneered, carefully stepping back to protect his Italian leather loafers from the mud. "She turns her back on a paid internship at the firm for this." It is a humiliating phase. She is playing in the dirt, while Nolan is actually networking. She will come begging for a bailout by spring. I had kept my head down, blinking away the rain, pretending the words did not sting. But my grandfather had not stayed under the umbrella. Theodore walked out into the pouring rain, his expensive wool coat soaking through instantly. He knelt in the mud beside me. He did not care about his shoes. He reached down and scooped up a handful of the dark, rich soil I had spent months amending. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, smelling the life in it. "She is not playing," Charles Theodore had said, his voice a low rumble that carried over the storm. "She is building." Theodore looked at my father, and for the first time I saw the unvarnished truth in the old man's eyes. He looked at his son and saw a parasite. He saw a man who only knew how to harvest, never how to plant. Then Theodore looked at me, his gaze softening into something fierce and proud. He handed me the carved piece of Oregon white oak that very afternoon. What I did not know, what no one in my family knew, was where Theodore went after he left my farm. He did not go home. He drove straight to Portland. He walked into a dimly lit coffee shop in the Pearl District, his coat still dripping with rainwater, and sat down in a back booth across from a much younger Arthur Caldwell. "I need to protect my legacy from my own son," Theodore had told the lawyer, sliding a thick file across the table. "Charles is a locust. He will consume everything I built to fund his own ego, and he will leave Diana with nothing. We need a vault he cannot crack." That secret had stayed buried for a decade, until this exact moment. Back in the boardroom, the silence was deafening. The golden pen rested on the table, forgotten. "What are you talking about, Caldwell?" my father demanded. His voice was rising now, the polished veneer cracking to reveal the insecure man beneath. "I am the sole executor of my father's holding company. I control the board. I know every asset he possessed." "You know the assets he allowed you to see," Caldwell replied smoothly. He unlatched his briefcase. The brass locks snapped open with a sound like a gunshot. "Theodore was a brilliant businessman, Charles, but he was an even better judge of character. He knew that the moment he passed, you would use his wealth to consolidate your own power. He knew you would try to freeze Diana out." My mother scoffed, crossing her arms. "This is ridiculous. Richard left his money to Nolan because Nolan is responsible. Diana is a contractor. She has no concept of wealth management." Caldwell did not even grace Abigail with a glance. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. He placed it squarely on the table between Higgins and my father. "10 years ago," Caldwell said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "Theodore Ford established a supplementary irrevocable trust. It was designed to remain dormant and legally shielded until 30 days after his death. Furthermore, it was structured to bypass the primary estate entirely. It does not require probate. It is not subject to board approval, and most importantly, Charles, it is immune to your interference. My father, face drained of color. He stared at the thick envelope as if it were a venomous snake. An irrevocable trust, funded with what I saw his ledgers. There was no missing capital. Not capital, Caldwell corrected. He looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. His gray eyes were warm, recognizing the dirt on my boots, recognizing the granddaughter Theodore had spoken of a decade ago. Higgins leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the envelope. You are saying Theodore Ford hid a separate estate. I am saying Theodore Ford protected his true legacy, Caldwell said. He turned his attention back to my father and my brother, who was now gripping the armrests of his chair, his smug confidence replaced by a creeping, primal panic. Nolan swallowed hard. What is in it? He asked, his voice cracking. Caldwell stepped back, allowing Higgins to break the wax seal. As the estate attorney pulled the heavy linen documents from the envelope, Caldwell delivered the final blow. A transfer of deed, Caldwell announced, and the immediate assignment of full, unencumbered ownership. Ownership of what? My father snapped, standing up from his chair. His fists were clenched at his sides. What did he hide from me? Higgins unfolded the first page. His eyes scanned the legal text. He stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. The color vanished from the attorney's face. He looked up, his gaze darting from my father to me, carrying the weight of a revelation that was about to shatter the earth beneath our feet. Charles Higgins whispered, his voice failing him. Charles. He left her the sanctuary. My father stumbled back as if he had been physically struck. The air left his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. No, he breathed. No, that is impossible. He sold that land. He told me he sold it. The room began to spin, the balance of power flipping so fast the sheer force of it felt electric. I did not need to see the paper to understand what was happening. I just needed to watch my brother's face crumble into pure, unadulterated terror. The game was over, and the real war had just begun. The name of the property hung in the sterile boardroom air, heavy and undeniable. The sanctuary. My father kept repeating the words under his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tight his knuckles turned a raw, stark white. He looked at Mr. Higgins, his eyes wide with a frantic pleading quality I had never witnessed before. He told me he liquidated that acreage in the 90s. My father stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He said the environmental regulations made it too difficult to log. He said he sold it to a state conservation fund. He told you what you needed to hear to stop asking questions, Caldwell replied, his tone remaining clinical and steady. Theodore recognized your tendency to leverage hard assets to fund speculative corporate ventures. He knew if he left the sanctuary on the primary ledger, you would strip mine it to inflate your quarterly earnings. So he severed it from the holding company entirely. He placed it in a blind trust 20 years ago, naming himself the sole trustee until his death. Higgins smoothed the thick linen paper flat against the table. His hands were shaking. I could hear the faint rustle of the parchment, a sound that felt louder than the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Read the legal description, Higgins Caldwell commanded. Let Charles hear exactly what he lost. Higgins cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously toward my father before settling on the document. The trust conveys sole, unencumbered ownership of parcel numbers 4 through 9, encompassing 3,000 contiguous acres of prime timberland situated on the western slopes of the Cascade Range. The property includes all standing timber mineral rights and natural waterways contained within the surveyed boundaries. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady, thumping rhythm that drowned out the hum of the office ventilation system. 3,000 acres. I knew this land. Anyone in the Oregon forestry industry knew the whispered rumors of the sanctuary. It was considered a mythical expanse of old-growth Douglas fir and pristine western hemlock. It was an ecosystem untouched by clear-cutting, a breathtaking stretch of earth that possessed its own weather patterns and deep, ancient root systems. I turned my gaze toward Nolan. My younger brother was staring at the table, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Nolan spent his life peddling illusions. His tech startup was built on buzzwords, pitch decks, and borrowed venture capital. He sold software that supposedly optimized global supply chains, yet his company had never actually moved a single physical box. His entire world existed on glowing screens, in lines of fabricated code, and in the inflated valuations printed in tech magazines. It was vapor. It was air that could vanish the moment the market shifted or a primary investor pulled their funding. My grandfather understood that fragile illusion. Theodore had watched Nolan burn through cash, throwing lavish launch parties for products that did not exist. Theodore knew that vapor could not sustain a legacy. So my grandfather gave me the earth. He gave me something you could touch, something that smelled of damp pine needles and rich, dark loam. He gave me 3,000 acres of physical reality that would stand long after Nolan's servers crashed and his venture capital dried up. The contrast was poetic and devastating. My brother inherited numbers and a bank account. I inherited the foundation of the state itself. "And what is the current appraisal?" Caldwell asked, prompting the estate attorney. Higgins swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his crisp, white collar. The most recent independent valuation conducted 3 weeks prior to Theodore passing places the combined land and timber value at $14 million. Higgins read, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The sound of Tiffany dropping her designer phone echoed sharply in the quiet room. It clattered against the polished wood, sliding a few inches before coming to a stop. She did not bother to pick it up. Her eyes were locked on me, wide and calculating, the previous disdain completely erased by the staggering figure she had just heard. $14 million. The $6 million my father and Nolan had been so proud of, the sum they had weaponized just moments ago to force my submission, suddenly looked like loose change. The power dynamic in the boardroom did not just shift, it inverted. "This is fraud!" Nolan yelled, finally finding his voice. He jumped up from his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He was panicking. It was not just the jealousy of a spoiled sibling. It was a visceral, desperate terror that I did not fully understand yet. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. He pointed a trembling finger at Caldwell. "You manipulated a sick old man. Grandpa was losing his mind at the end. He did not know what he was signing." Theodore passed a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation the day before he finalized this trust. Caldwell countered, his expression hardening into stone. He was sharper than anyone else in this room. He anticipated this exact reaction, Nolan. He knew you would cry foul. The trust is bulletproof. Abigail, my mother, sat frozen. Her beige cashmere sweater seemed to swallow her. The woman who had spent 3 decades treating me like a disappointing stain on her perfect family portrait was now staring at a daughter who held more wealth and power than her husband and her favored son combined. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I kept my hands resting lightly on the table. My fingers curled inward, brushing against the rough edges of the carved piece of Oregon white oak hidden in my pocket. The heat of the wood seeped into my skin. For the first time in my 32 years, I did not feel the crushing weight of my family judgment. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound validation. My grandfather had seen me. During every holiday dinner where I was ignored, during every passive-aggressive comment about my modest income, during every moment I spent alone in the rain tending to the soil, Theodore had been watching. He had recognized my quiet endurance. He had seen the invisible sacrifices I made to live an authentic life, and he had reached across the threshold of death to reward my integrity. I did not need to gloat. I did not need to scream or throw their cruelty back in their faces. My mere existence in this room, holding the deed to the sanctuary, was the ultimate retribution. "Well, Caldwell," said, breaking the heavy silence as he snapped his battered leather briefcase shut. "Since the primary estate distribution is now clear, and the secondary trust requires no further probate action from this office, our business here is concluded." Caldwell looked at me, offering a brief, respectful nod. "The title deeds and management portfolios will be couriered to your personal attorney by tomorrow morning, Miss Ford. It was an honor executing your grandfather's final wishes." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice calm and even. I stood up from my chair. I did not look at the golden pen still resting on the table. It was a relic of a past where they held leverage over me. That leverage was gone. I picked up my canvas jacket, slipping my arms into the worn sleeves, feeling the comforting weight of the fabric. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I expected them to shout. I expected my father to hurl threats or my brother to throw a tantrum. But the room remained eerily silent. The realization of their defeat had paralyzed them. I stepped out of the boardroom and into the expansive, softly lit corridor of the law firm. My boots clicked against the marble tiles, a steady, rhythmic sound that signaled my exit. The air out here felt lighter, easier to breathe. But as I reached the elevator bank and pressed the call button, the heavy doors of the boardroom swung open behind me. Quick, frantic footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Diana, wait!" It was my mother. Her voice did not carry the sharp, dismissive edge I had known my entire life. It was pitched higher, dripping with a sudden, unsettling, honeyed sweetness. I turned around to see Abigail and Charles hurrying toward me, leaving Nolan and Tiffany behind in the boardroom. My parents' faces had undergone a terrifying transformation. The arrogant hostility was gone, replaced by a mask of manufactured warmth and desperate affection. They were smiling. It was the kind of smile a predator wears when it realizes brute force will not work, and the only way to capture the prey is to lure it into a trap. The elevator bell chimed behind me, but I did not step inside. I stood my ground, watching the people who had just tried to erase me pivot to their next strategy. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung shut behind me, sealing Nolan and Tiffany inside. But the quiet of the corridor provided zero sanctuary. Rapid footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor. My parents were moving fast. They bypassed the slow dignity they usually maintained in public spaces, driven by a raw, naked panic that had stripped away their polished veneer. "Diana, wait!" The voice belonged to my mother, yet it sounded entirely foreign. For my entire life, Abigail Ford spoke to me using the tonal equivalent of frost. Her default setting was a sharp, dismissive sigh. Now her pitch was higher, breathless, and laced with a terrifying artificial warmth. I stopped halfway to the elevator bank and turned around. The expansive lobby of the Portland law firm stretched out between us, decorated with tasteful modern art and cold leather sofas. Outside, the rain continued to batter the glass, a chaotic drumbeat against the silent tension building inside. My parents rushed forward and effectively boxed me in. My father positioned himself between me and the elevator call button, while my mother stepped directly into my personal space. The scent of her expensive jasmine perfume hit me sharp and overwhelming, carrying decades of memories I preferred to keep buried. "Oh, sweetheart," my mother breathed. She reached out her manicured fingers, gently grasping my forearm. The physical contact sent a jolt of shock straight up my spine. My mother did not touch me. She tolerated brief, rigid hugs at Thanksgiving, but she never initiated casual, affectionate contact. Her thumb rubbed small circles against the tough canvas of my jacket. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Less than 10 minutes ago, this same woman had looked down her nose at these exact clothes, mocking my career and eagerly awaiting my legal erasure. Now she was looking up at me, with wide, glistening eyes playing the role of a deeply concerned, loving matriarch. What a shock for all of us. Abigail continued, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Your grandfather, bless his heart. We had no idea he was keeping such secrets in his final years. It is just so much to process, isn't it?" I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up to her face. The corners of her eyes were tight. The performance was good enough to fool any casual observer in this lobby, but I had spent 32 years studying the micro-expressions of my abusers. I saw the calculation ticking behind her pupils. My father stepped closer, running a hand through his graying hair. He let out a long, heavy sigh, playing the part of the exhausted but reasonable patriarch. "It is a mess, Diana. A terrible, complicated mess. Dad meant well, I am sure of it, but his mind was simply failing him toward the end." I kept my face perfectly neutral. "Was it?" I asked, keeping my tone flat. Mr. Caldwell seemed quite confident in his psychological evaluations. Charles waved a dismissive hand, a gesture he used whenever reality contradicted his preferred narrative. "You know how those doctors are. You pay them enough, they sign whatever paperwork you put in front of them." Dad was confused. He isolated himself out there in the woods. He lost touch with the complexities of the modern market. He did not understand what dividing the assets like this would do to the family structure. The family structure. He meant his own bank account. He meant his own leverage. "Listen to me, Diana," my father said, lowering his voice into a soothing, paternal register he usually reserved for calming down nervous investors. 3,000 acres of prime timberland is not a gift. It is a monumental liability. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you. There are environmental compliance regulations, liability insurances, poachers, forest management fees. You are a consultant. You advise people on dirt. You do not have the infrastructure or the capital to maintain an asset of this scale. It will ruin your life." I watched his jaw clench, a tiny tell betraying the immense effort it took to speak to me as an equal rather than a subordinate. "We can help you," my mother chimed in, squeezing my arm tighter. Her eyes searched mine, looking for the vulnerable little girl she had spent decades cultivating. "We want to help you, sweetheart. We can have Mr. Higgins draft a transfer of deed right now before the ink even dries on Caldwell paperwork. We can fold the sanctuary back into the primary holding company. Nolan can manage the corporate burden, and we can make sure you are compensated fairly. A nice lump sum. Enough to pay off your little cabin in the mountains." The bait was dangling right in front of me. A nice lump sum. Freedom from debt. But more intoxicating than the money was the promise hidden beneath her words. The promise of inclusion. If I signed the land over, they would praise me. They would invite me to the Sunday dinners without rolling their eyes. My father would clap me on the shoulder. My mother would boast to her friends about her generous, selfless daughter. For a few fleeting weeks, I would experience the conditional, transactional love I had starved for since childhood. My biology screamed at me to comply. The human brain is hardwired to seek safety within the family unit. When you are raised by narcissists, your survival mechanism trains you to fawn, to appease, to surrender your own boundaries to keep the predators calm. A phantom weight settled on my chest. I felt a sudden, dizzying urge to just nod, to say yes, to hand over the $14 million estate, just to make the terrifying pressure stop. Nolan needs this, Diana, my father added, leaning in closer, sensing my internal hesitation. The tech sector is brutal right now. His startup requires capital to scale. If he does not have the backing of the full estate, his investors might panic. You know how hard your brother works. You know the stress he carries. Do not do this to him. Do not tear us apart over a senile old man, clerical error. The mention of Nolan snapped the spell. I looked at my father. I thought about how hard my brother worked. Nolan spent his 20s crashing expensive cars, failing out of prestigious business programs, and treating everyone around him like disposable stepping stones. My parents had attended his court hearings to pay off his DUI fines, yet they had skipped my college graduation because it conflicted with a golf tournament. They did not want to protect me from the burden of the land. They wanted to feed me to the golden child. I looked at my mother hand still gripping my jacket. I thought about the decades I spent shrinking myself, biting my tongue, accepting the scraps of affection they threw on the floor. I thought about my grandfather Theodore, walking out into the freezing Oregon rain to look at the soil I had planted. He had seen my worth when my own parents refused to open their eyes. Theodore had built a vault they could not crack, and now they were begging me to hand them the combination. "Please, Diana," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking with a masterfully faked tear. "Be the bigger person. Do the right thing. Keep the family whole." I reached up and placed my hand over my mother's fingers. For a split second, a triumphant gleam sparked in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the obedient scapegoat was returning to her pen. I gripped her wrist, peeling her manicured hand off my jacket with slow, deliberate force. I let her arm drop to her side. I took a step back, breaking their physical containment. I felt the solid weight of the carved oak in my pocket anchoring me to the earth, reminding me of my roots. The frantic beating of my heart slowed, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I was no longer fighting the frightened child inside me. I had finally outgrown her. I looked my father in the eyes, watching the desperate anticipation written across his aging face. I looked at my mother, whose fake smile was beginning to tremble at the edges. "No," I said. It was a single syllable spoken quietly, yet it hit the marble lobby like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was entirely different from the quiet in the boardroom. This was the silence of a vacuum sucking all the air out of the space. My father blinked, his brow furrowing, as if I had spoken a language he did not understand. "What did you say?" "I said no," I repeated, my voice steady, ringing with an authority I had never allowed myself to use in their presence. "I am not signing the sanctuary over to Nolan. I am not folding it into the holding company. I am not taking a lump sum. The land belongs to me. Grandfather made his intentions perfectly clear, and I intend to honor them." The transformation in my mother was instantaneous and horrifying. The sweet, pleading matriarch vanished. The muscles in her face tightened, pulling her features into a sharp, reptilian mask of pure fury. Her eyes went flat and dark. "You ungrateful little brat," Abigail hissed, her voice dropping the maternal act entirely. Her tone was venomous, meant to cut straight to the bone. "After everything we have done for you, after everything we provided—" "You provided nothing but a shadow for me to stand in," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "And I am done standing in it." Charles stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. He pointed a finger inches from my face. "You have no idea what you are doing, Diana. You think you can walk away with our family legacy and just go back to playing in the dirt? You think you can humiliate us in front of Caldwell and Higgins and face zero consequences?" "I did not humiliate you," I said, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides, refusing to match his physical aggression. "Your own greed humiliated you. You spent my entire life telling me I was worth nothing, Charles. You cannot be angry when I finally believe you enough to walk away." "You are making an enemy of this family," my father growled, his voice vibrating with a rage so intense it bordered on feral. "We built this community. We know every investor, every agricultural board member, every major client in the Willamette Valley. If you walk out those doors with Nolan's inheritance, I promise you, I will make sure your little consulting business is starved out of existence by the end of the fiscal quarter. You will be blacklisted from Portland to Eugene." He was threatening my livelihood. He was promising to destroy the only thing I had built for myself. A cold shiver raced down my arms, but I did not let it show on my face. "Then I suggest you get started," I said. I turned my back on them. I pressed the illuminated button for the elevator. The doors slid open with a soft, accommodating chime. I stepped inside the empty car and turned around. My parents stood in the center of the grand lobby, staring at me with a hatred so profound it took my breath away. They looked like strangers. Perhaps they always had been. The steel doors began to close, narrowing the gap until only a sliver of the lobby remained visible. In that final fraction of a second, I saw my father reach into his tailored suit for his cell phone, his thumb already swiping across the screen. The doors sealed shut, locking me in the quiet descent toward the street level. The initial victory faded into the metallic hum of the elevator car. My hands began to shake, a delayed reaction to the sheer adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had drawn the line in the sand, but as the elevator carried me down to the rainy streets of Portland, I knew the real war was just beginning. They were going to try and destroy my life, and I had to figure out how to survive the storm they were about to unleash. The drive back to the Willamette Valley felt longer than usual. The rhythmic thrum of the tires against the wet asphalt usually brought me a sense of peace, a physical transition from the sterile concrete of Portland back to the rich, damp earth of the Cascade Range. But that evening, the heavy Oregon rain mirrored the storm brewing in my chest. I kept my hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, my knuckles pale in the dashboard light. My father had promised to starve my consulting business out of existence. He had promised to leverage every connection, every country club handshake, and every corporate favor he possessed to ensure I could not earn a living in my own state. I tried to tell myself it was a hollow threat, the frantic barking of a man who had just lost his leverage. Charles Ford was powerful, but my clients were independent farmers, sustainable timber operators, and artisan viticulturists. They hired me because I delivered results. I tested their soil, tracked their watershed health, and designed crop rotation strategies that increased their yields while protecting the local ecosystem. I provided a tangible service that had nothing to do with my family high society politics. But a quiet, insidious dread settled in my stomach as I pulled into the gravel driveway of my cabin. 3,000 acres of prime timberland was a staggering inheritance, but it was not liquid cash. The sanctuary was a living, breathing ecosystem. It came with property taxes, liability insurance premiums, and land management fees. If my consulting income dried up, I would not be able to afford the holding costs. The state would eventually step in. I would be forced to sell the land just to pay the debts attached to it. The gift my grandfather intended as my salvation could easily become the anchor that drowned me. That Monday morning, the reality of my father threat knocked on my door. I was sitting at my kitchen table nursing a cup of black coffee, reviewing a soil amendment proposal for a local organic hop farm. The farm belonged to a man named Marcus, a third-generation grower who had been my most consistent client for 3 years. We were scheduled to begin a massive cover crop implementation by the end of the week. My phone buzzed against the wooden table. Marcus' name flashed on the screen. I picked it up expecting a question about the seed order. Instead, I was met with a tight, uncomfortable silence. Diana Marcus began, his voice lacking its usual boisterous warmth. He sounded strained, as if he were reading from a prepared script. Listen, I am calling because we need to pause the consulting contract. Indefinitely. I set my coffee mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the wood. Pause the contract, I repeated, striving to keep my tone level. Marcus, the planting window closes in 10 days. If we do not get the root systems established before the freeze, you will lose the topsoil on the western slope. We already ordered the materials. I know, he said, letting out a heavy sigh. And I will pay the invoice for the seeds. But my investors had a meeting this weekend. We are restructuring our operational budget. We are bringing the environmental consulting in-house. I am sorry, Diana. My hands are tied. He hung up before I could ask another question. I stared at the dark screen of my phone. Marcus did not have corporate investors. His farm was family-owned. His hands were not tied by a board of directors. They were tied by someone who had leaned on his primary distributors, threatening his supply chain if he continued doing business with me. My father was moving faster than I had anticipated. The next morning brought the second blow. Elena ran a heritage apple orchard on the edge of the valley. We were in the middle of negotiating a complex water conservation grant with the county. Her call came before 8 in the morning. She did not bother with pleasantries. We are going in a different direction, Elena said. Her tone clipped and frigid. Elena, we are days away from submitting the grant proposal, I replied, standing up from my desk. The sudden loss of income was beginning to form a knot of genuine panic in my chest. Did I miscalculate the watershed data? If there is an issue with the metrics, we can revise the draft today. There is no issue with the metrics, she answered sharply. There is an issue with values. I run a business built on community trust, Diana. I cannot have my brand associated with someone possessing your kind of character. I wish you the best of luck. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. Character. Marcus had offered a flimsy business excuse, but Elena had made it personal. She sounded disgusted, speaking to me as if I were something toxic she needed to scrape off her shoe. I walked over to the window, looking out at the dense tree line surrounding my property. The financial math began spinning in my head, a terrifying carousel of numbers. The consulting revenue from Marcus and Elena represented 40% of my annual income. Without those contracts, my cash flow would evaporate by the end of the quarter. The first property tax installment for the sanctuary was due in 90 days. If I missed it, the penalties would snowball. For a terrifying hour, I believed my parents had won. I paced the wooden floors of my cabin, tracing the inevitable sequence of ruin. I would default on the taxes. The county would place a lien on the timberland. I would be forced to liquidate the 3,000 acres to a commercial logging corporation just to clear the debt. The ancient Douglas firs would be clear-cut, the ecosystem shredded, and my grandfather legacy would be turned into board feet and profit margins. I would lose everything. Then my phone rang for the third time that week. It was David, a local viticulturist and one of the few people in the valley I considered a genuine friend. He ran a small testing lab where I sent my soil samples. "Are you sitting down?" David asked the moment I answered. I braced my hand against the window frame. What did my father do now? I asked, my voice tight. It is not your father, David said. It is your sister-in-law. He proceeded to outline the execution of a masterpiece in social sabotage. Over the weekend, the Willamette Valley Wine Association hosted their annual charity gala. It was the premier networking event for wealthy landowners, vineyard operators, and agricultural investors. I never attended those events, preferring to let my work speak for itself. But Tiffany had attended. She bought a VIP table, David explained, his voice hushed with disbelief. She wore a designer gown and spent the entire evening cornering every major player in the local agriculture scene. Elena was at the table next to her. Marcus' main distributor was pouring the wine. What did she say? I asked, though my stomach was already twisting into knots. She played the grieving, heartbroken family member, David said. She told everyone that your grandfather suffered from severe, undocumented dementia in his final months. She claimed you isolated him from the rest of the family. She said you manipulated a dying, confused old man into signing over the family estate, cutting out your brother, who had actually been paying for the medical care. My breath caught in my throat. She told them you withheld his pain medication to force his signature. David finished, his tone heavy with disgust. She framed you as an elder abuser, Diana. She said your father was too devastated to press criminal charges, but that the family was warning the community for their own safety. She warned them not to trust you. The sheer audacity of the fabrication hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was not just a rumor. It was a calculated, vicious assassination of my core identity. Tiffany had weaponized my absence. Because I was not there to defend myself, because I lived quietly and kept my head down, she painted her own monstrous portrait of me on a blank canvas. She turned my dedication to my grandfather into a predatory crime. I thanked David for his honesty and ended the call. I stood in the center of my quiet cabin, surrounded by topographical maps and soil charts. A violent, white-hot rage flared in my chest. It was a sudden, blinding heat that made my hands shake and my vision narrow. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over my contacts, scrolling rapidly until I found Tiffany's name. The urge to press call was overwhelming. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to drive back to Portland, kick down the door of her pristine condo, and drag her out into the street. I wanted to confront her with the medical records, with the truth, with the righteous fury of a woman who had been wronged for 3 decades. I wanted to force her to call Elena and Marcus and choke on her own lies. My thumb pressed down on the screen, resting a millimeter above the call button. Then my gaze caught the carved piece of Oregon white oak sitting on my desk. I lowered the phone. I walked over and picked up the wood, letting its rough, grounding texture press into my palm. If I called Tiffany, I would be giving them exactly what they wanted. They were baiting me. If I screamed at her, she would record the call. She would play it for her social circle as proof of my erratic, aggressive behavior. See, she would say, sipping her Pinot Noir. Listen to how unstable she is. Confrontation was their arena. They thrived on drama, on shouting matches, on the messy emotional warfare that left everyone covered in mud. If I engaged in a public screaming match, it would only validate the smear campaign. I would look defensive. I would look guilty. I set the phone face down on the desk. The rage in my chest did not dissipate, but it changed temperature. It cooled from a blinding fire into a sharp, focused ice. My family wanted to play a game of strategy using whispers and lies to starve me out of my own life. They thought I would panic. They thought I would crumble under the financial pressure and surrender the land. I realized I could not fight a rumor with the truth. The people at those winery events did not care about the truth. They cared about the spectacle. To beat my family, I had to stop playing defense. I had to secure my financial fortress, and then I had to strike back using a weapon they could not gossip their way out of. I looked at the topographical map of the 3,000 acres pinned to my wall. The sanctuary was not a liability. It was an arsenal. I just needed to unlock it. I stared at the topographical map pinned to the rough-hewn planks of my cabin wall. The intricate contour lines formed a topographical fingerprint of the 3,000 acres my grandfather had entrusted to me. My phone sat silent on the desk. The impulse to call my sister-in-law and scream until my voice gave out was a fading ember, replaced by the cold logic of survival. My family believed they could orchestrate my financial ruin by turning the local agricultural community against me. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of the impending property taxes and beg them for a buyout. They assumed my inheritance was an idle trophy. They forgot that I knew how to harvest. I rolled up the blueprints for my pending agricultural projects and set them aside. My consulting business was bleeding, but it was not my only resource. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved months ago, long before the boardroom reading. The number belonged to Elias Thorne, the founder of a progressive forestry management firm based out of Eugene. Elias was not a traditional logger. He held dual degrees in forestry and environmental science. His crews specialized in ecological finning, a process that removed diseased secondary growth and excessive brush to prevent wildfires while leaving the ancient canopy untouched. It was the exact type of stewardship Theodore had envisioned. Elias answered on the second ring. We skipped the pleasantries. I told him I had acquired the deed to the sanctuary and that I was ready to open a designated section of the western slope for immediate selective harvest. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with professional awe. Every timber operator in the Pacific Northwest knew the legend of that acreage. Within 2 hours, Elias was driving his mud-splattered truck up the winding mountain road to my property. We spent the afternoon hiking through the dense forest. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, coating the ferns and moss in a vibrant, shimmering green. The air smelled of ozone, crushed pine, and damp earth. Walking beneath the towering Douglas firs, some measuring 10 feet across at the trunk, the reality of my inheritance finally settled into my bones. This was not just a financial asset. It was a living monument. Elias took soil samples, measured canopy density, and ran the calculations on a waterproof tablet. He understood the assignment perfectly. We would not clear-cut a single acre. The extraction would be surgical, targeting only the choked understory that threatened the health of the primary trees. It would improve the overall vitality of the woodland while yielding high-quality specialty timber. We sat on the tailgate of his truck as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long purple shadows across the valley. Elias drafted a preliminary agreement on the spot. He offered a staggering initial deposit, a sum reflecting the premium grade of the wood and the sheer volume of the designated harvest zones. I signed the digital contract with the stylus. By the time I woke up the next morning, the wire transfer had cleared. I logged into my banking portal and stared at the glowing numbers on my laptop screen. A 7-figure deposit rested securely in my account. The suffocating weight of the upcoming property taxes dissolved into thin air. The financial guillotine my father had tried to drop on my neck shattered. My fortress was funded. Now it was time to deploy the artillery. I did not need a polite estate attorney anymore. I needed a predator. I drove into downtown Portland and walked into the sleek glass offices of Veronica Cole. Veronica was a high-stakes litigator who specialized in corporate defamation and tortious interference. She was renowned in legal circles for her ruthless precision and her refusal to settle quietly when a client reputation was on the line. I sat across from her polished obsidian desk and laid out the entire situation, from the canceled consulting contracts to the specific lies Tiffany had peddled at the Wine Association gala. Veronica listened without interrupting, her sharp hazel eyes assessing the data. When I finished, she did not offer empty sympathy. She simply pulled a legal pad toward her and uncapped a fountain pen. "We are not going to ask her for an apology," Veronica said, her voice smooth and devoid of mercy. "We are going to remind her that speech has a price tag." Over the next 48 hours, Veronica drafted a 5-page cease and desist letter. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It did not merely demand that Tiffany stop spreading falsehoods. It systematically dismantled her lies, citing medical records, the independent psychiatric evaluations Caldwell had secured for Theodore, and sworn affidavits from laboratory technicians who had heard the rumors firsthand. The document explicitly stated our intent to file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for tortious interference with prospective economic advantage, naming Tiffany personally and targeting her private assets. But Veronica did not mail the letter to my brother's house. That would have allowed Tiffany to hide it, to control the narrative, to play the victim in private. Tiffany worked as a senior account executive at a luxury public relations firm in the Pearl District. Her entire career hinged on her pristine image, her discretion, and her ability to manage wealthy clients without generating scandals of her own. Veronica hired a process server to deliver the heavy certified envelope directly to the firm reception desk during the busiest hour of the morning. I received the update from David, my viticulturist friend, 3 days later. The local gossip mill, which had been churning out poison about me all week, suddenly reversed its current with whiplash-inducing speed. David called me while I was inspecting a new irrigation setup on my land. "You should have seen the fallout," he said, a note of grim satisfaction evident in his tone. The process server handed the envelope to the receptionist, but because it was marked urgent legal correspondence regarding corporate liability, it went straight to the managing partner desk. I leaned against the wooden post of my porch, watching the rain clouds gather over the peaks. "What did the partner do?" "He pulled Tiffany out of a client meeting," David reported. "The whole office saw it. A public relations firm cannot afford to employ an executive who is engaged in a verifiable defamation campaign against a prominent landowner. It is a catastrophic liability for their brand." Tiffany was stripped of her client-facing accounts before lunch. She has been confined to internal data entry, and there are whispers that she might be let go by the end of the month. The image of Tiffany, who had mocked my work clothes and laughed at the prospect of me pulling weeds, now trapped in a cubicle doing data entry, brought a cool wave of closure. I did not feel joyous. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of a properly balanced scale. The sudden, humiliating exposure of her lies acted as a harsh disinfectant across the Willamette Valley. The rumors surrounding my grandfather passing evaporated overnight. The artisan farmers who had distanced themselves from me realized they had been played by a bitter, spiteful relative. Within a week, the hop farmer who had canceled his contract called me back, offering a stuttering apology and asking if I could fit him back into my schedule. I told him my rates had increased, and he agreed without hesitation. My consulting practice did not just stabilize, it solidified, insulated by a new layer of unspoken respect. I had won the battle. I had secured my land, protected my livelihood, and silenced the primary mouthpiece of my family's smear campaign. I thought the worst of the storm had passed. I thought they would retreat into their Portland mansion and lick their wounds. I was wrong. Late that Friday evening, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Veronica Cole name. I answered, expecting a routine update on the legal filings. "Diana," Veronica said, skipping her usual formal greeting. Her tone was tight, stripped of its usual unshakable confidence. "Are you alone at the cabin?" "Yes," I replied, a sudden chill prickling the back of my neck. What is wrong? Has Tiffany tried to retaliate? This is not about your sister-in-law, Veronica said. While my team was running the standard asset discovery on Nolan, preparing for the potential lawsuit, we uncovered something that changes the entire landscape of this dispute. I walked over to the window, staring out into the dark, impenetrable forest. What did you find? Veronica let out a slow breath. Your brother tech startup is not a functioning business, Diana. It is a ghost ship. He has no product, no revenue, and no real investors left, but he does have debt. How much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Millions, Veronica confirmed. And he did not borrow it from traditional banks. The entities holding his promissory notes are not the kind of people who take him to civil court. They're the kind of people who take everything you have. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. The frantic desperation in the boardroom. My father demand that I fold the land into the holding company. Tiffany, clumsy, frantic attempt to ruin my reputation and force a quick sale. They did not hate me because I was a disappointment. They were hunting me because Nolan was drowning, and my grandfather 3,000 acres was the only life raft left. The encrypted file from Veronica arrived in my inbox just past midnight. The glow from my laptop screen illuminated the rough wooden walls of my cabin, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. Outside, the wind howled through the Douglas firs, a wild, untamed sound that felt fitting for the storm I was about to uncover. I clicked the secure link typed in the alphanumeric password my attorney had provided and watched a dense 70-page dossier load onto my screen. As I scrolled through the forensic accounting reports, the bank statements, and the private investigator summaries, the arrogant, untouchable image of my younger brother dissolved into ash. Nolan was not a visionary tech CEO. He was a spectacular, staggering fraud. His startup was nothing but an elaborate, glittering facade. He had pitched a revolutionary logistics software, an algorithm promised to streamline global shipping routes and save distributors millions. Based on that pitch, he secured an initial seed round of venture capital. But the software did not exist. The engineers he hired were junior contractors who spent their days building a sleek user interface, a beautiful, interactive dashboard that displayed simulated data. There was no back-end code. There was no proprietary algorithm. It was vapor. I read through the expense reports tracing the devastating burn rate. Nolan had not spent his investors' capital on development. He spent it on maintaining the illusion of a titan. He leased a penthouse office in a premium downtown high-rise. He threw lavish, catered launch parties. He chartered private flights to conferences wearing tailored suits and pouring expensive champagne, playing the part of a Silicon Valley prodigy, while his company produced nothing but empty air. When the initial funding inevitably dried up and his board of directors started demanding a beta product, Nolan panicked. Instead of admitting failure, he pivoted to crime. The dossier detailed a series of falsified user engagement metrics. Nolan had fabricated quarterly performance reports, padding the numbers to show exponential growth. He emailed those doctored reports to his investors across state lines to secure a Series B funding round. By hitting send on those emails, my brother crossed a perilous, unforgiving line. He graduated from gross corporate mismanagement into federal wire fraud. The Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission were already circling their preliminary inquiries buried in the appendix of Veronica file. But the federal threat was not the most urgent fire burning down his life. The Series B funding never materialized. The institutional investors asked too many questions, demanding independent audits Nolan could not provide. Desperate to keep the lights on and the facade intact before the truth leaked, he turned to the shadow market. He borrowed money from an unregulated, aggressive private equity syndicate. These were not bankers who settled disputes in civil court. They were ruthless operators who demanded exorbitant interest rates and enforced their collections with terrifying, life-altering consequences. Nolan owed them $4 million. The principal was due in less than 30 days. I sat back in my chair, the cold glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The sheer scale of his deception took my breath away. Everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks suddenly shifted, recontextualized by this staggering revelation. I closed my eyes and transported myself back to the sterile boardroom in Portland. I pictured Nolan sitting at the mahogany table, smirking, steepling his fingers, and magnanimously offering to hire me to pull weeds at his new coastal mansion. The audience in that room, Mr. Higgins, my parents, even me, had watched a man radiating unearned confidence. But looking behind the curtain, the dramatic irony was breathtaking. Nolan was not swaggering. He was suffocating. Underneath the bespoke charcoal suit, he must have been sweating through his shirt. When he tapped his expensive leather shoes against the floor, it was not impatience. It was the frantic, erratic rhythm of a man whose time was running out. He needed the $6 million primary estate to pay off the shadow syndicate and hire a defense team for the impending federal indictment. But even that $6 million was an illusion of safety. The coastal mansion and the stock portfolios were locked in probate. Liquidating those assets would take months, perhaps a year. The private equity syndicate would not wait a year. They would not wait a month. Nolan needed liquid cash immediately. That was why my parents had cornered me in the lobby. That was why my father had demanded I fold the 3,000 acres of prime harvest-ready timberland into the holding company. Timber was a hard asset that could be borrowed against instantly. A logging contract like the one I had just secured with Elias Thorne could yield a 7-figure payout in a matter of days. My grandfather's sanctuary was the only life raft capable of keeping Nolan out of a federal penitentiary and safe from violent creditors. A chilling, profound clarity washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. My parents knew. Charles and Abigail had to know the extent of the disaster. My father sat on corporate boards. He understood forensic accounting. He knew his golden child was facing ruin. They had orchestrated the boardroom ambush, the harsh ultimatums, and the vicious smear campaign not out of petty spite, but out of a primal, terrifying desperation. They were willing to sacrifice my reputation, my consulting business, and my entire future to plug the gaping hole in Nolan's sinking ship. They viewed me as acceptable collateral damage. My destruction was a price they were eager to pay to maintain their flawless family image and keep their favored son out of handcuffs. I opened my eyes and looked at the carved piece of Oregon white oak resting beside my keyboard. Theodore had known too. My grandfather had seen the rot festering inside his son and grandson. He knew that if he left the timberland and the primary estate, Charles would instantly liquidate the ancient evergreens to cover Nolan criminal debts. Theodore had built the irrevocable trust to ensure that the only person holding the key to the vault was the one person who could not be bought, bullied, or manipulated. I was no longer just the scapegoat defending my pride. I was the warden. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the window. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust off the glass. The stakes of this war had escalated far beyond a sibling rivalry or a fight over inheritance. This was a battle for survival. My family was trapped in a burning building of their own making. They had tried to lock me inside, to take the flames for them. Now that they realized I had the only key to the exit, their tactics would change. They could no longer rely on social pressure or country club gossip. A cease and desist letter had silenced Tiffany, but it would not stop a father desperate to save his son from prison. The smear campaign was just the opening skirmish. The real assault was coming. A predator is never more dangerous than when it is cornered, starving, and bleeding. Charles and Abigail were out of polite options. They were going to resort to something darker, something deeply manipulative, leveraging the one weakness they believed I still possessed. They thought I still carried a shred of familial loyalty, a lingering desire for their approval that could be exploited in a crisis. I watched the tree line sway in the fierce wind. My phone sat quietly on the desk, holding the secrets that would soon tear my family apart. I knew a trap was being set. I knew my father would manufacture an emergency to force my hand, utilizing the ultimate guilt trip to drag me back into their web. I turned away from the window, my mind sharp and focused. They were going to demand a rescue. They were going to beg for a savior. But they were about to discover that the daughter they spent 3 decades trying to erase had finally learned how to close the door and throw away the key. The revelations within Veronica Dossier hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs and leaving a hollow, aching void in my chest. The rain continued its relentless assault against the cabin windows, a chaotic symphony that mirrored the turbulence churning within my mind. For 32 years, I had accepted the narrative my family spoon-fed me. I was the difficult child, the disappointment, the stubborn outlier who refused to conform to their polished corporate ideals. They were the successful, cohesive unit, and I was the broken piece that did not fit. But the truth laid bare in forensic accounting reports and intercepted emails was a grotesque inversion of that reality. Nolan, the golden child, the supposed prodigy, was a criminal. He had not just failed at business, he had engaged in deliberate, systematic fraud, stealing millions from investors and borrowing heavily from dangerous, unregulated syndicates. And my parents, the pillars of Portland High society, were not merely enabling him. They were actively participating in a cover-up, attempting to sacrifice my future to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. It was one thing to be marginalized, to be overlooked at family dinners, or to be mocked for my career choices. It was an entirely different level of cruelty to be weaponized. They did not corner me in that lobby out of a misguided sense of family unity. They cornered me because they needed a human shield. They needed my grandfather's legacy, the 3,000 acres of pristine timberland, to plug the gaping hole in Nolan's sinking ship. They were willing to bankrupt me, to destroy the ecosystem I loved, to auction off my independence to the highest bidder, all to keep their favored son out of a federal penitentiary. A profound, sickening realization washed over me. Every interaction, every forced smile, every guilt trip over the past 2 weeks had been a calculated maneuver in a desperate, high-stakes game of survival. They did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as an asset to be liquidated. The emotional pain, which had been a dull, familiar ache for decades, suddenly sharpened into a searing, white-hot agony. It felt as though a vital organ was being excised without anesthesia. The last lingering shred of hope, the tiny, foolish part of me that still yearned for their approval, withered and died in that moment. I picked up the carved piece of Oregon white oak, feeling its rough texture grounding me against the rising tide of panic. Theodore had known. My grandfather had seen through their polished veneer and recognized the rot festering beneath. He knew they would consume everything in their path to protect their fragile illusions. That was why he built the irrevocable trust. He did not just leave me the land. He gave me the only weapon capable of severing the ties that bound me to their toxicity. I was not just fighting for trees anymore. I was fighting for my life. If they succeeded in breaking the trust or coercing me into a transfer, the fallout would not be contained to Nolan debts. The Shadow Syndicate would not care whose name was on the deed once the assets were commingled. They would come for everything, and my parents would eagerly throw me to the wolves to buy themselves another day of freedom. The resolve that hardened within me was absolute. It was no longer a matter of pride or spite. It was a matter of self-preservation. I had to become the fortress my grandfather intended me to be. I had to become untouchable. I closed the dossier, the encrypted file, vanishing into the digital ether, leaving only the stark reality of the battle ahead. I picked up my phone and drafted a brief, decisive message to Veronica Cole. Proceed with the selective logging contracts and accelerate the trust integration. Ensure the firewalls are impenetrable. I hit send, the confirmation ping echoing in the quiet cabin. The first phase of my counteroffensive was in motion. I had secured the capital, silenced the smear campaign, and exposed their hidden vulnerabilities. But I knew my parents would not surrender. They were wounded, desperate, and running out of time. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with anticipation. The storm outside raged on, bending the ancient evergreens, testing their roots against the gale. I watched them sway, drawing strength from their resilience. They had survived centuries of harsh winters, fires, and drought. They endured because they were deeply rooted in the earth, connected to something larger than themselves. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden desk. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I stared at the screen, watching the name pulse with a frantic, demanding energy. For a fleeting moment, the old instincts flared, the urge to answer, to appease, to avoid the conflict. But the girl who would have answered that call no longer existed. She had been replaced by the woman who held the deed to the sanctuary. I let it ring. The sound filled the cabin, a jarring intrusion into my hard-won peace. It rang until it hit voicemail, leaving behind a profound, resonating silence. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time it was my mother. The escalation was palpable. They were testing the boundaries, searching for a crack in my defenses. They were operating under the assumption that I was still susceptible to their emotional manipulation. They were about to discover how spectacularly wrong they were. I rejected the call, sliding the red icon across the screen. The barrage continued throughout the night. Text messages flooded my inbox, each one more frantic and manipulative than the last. Diana, please, we need to talk. It is an emergency. Your father is not well. Call me back immediately. I ignored them all, systematically deleting the messages without reading beyond the first few words. They were pulling every lever, deploying every guilt trip they had honed over 32 years. But their words held no power over me anymore. I saw the desperate, drowning people behind the digital pleas. By morning, the storm had broken, leaving the Willamette Valley bathed in a soft, pale sunlight. The air smelled clean, washed free of the dust and debris. I stood on my porch holding a steaming mug of coffee, watching the mist rise from the dense canopy of the surrounding forest. My phone chimed with a new notification. It was a message from an unfamiliar number, but the context was unmistakable. Diana, this is Aunt Patricia. Your father has been admitted to Portland General. He suffered a severe cardiac event early this morning. Abigail is beside herself. You need to come down here immediately. The message sat on the screen, a cold, calculated demand disguised as a family emergency. The timing was too perfect, the escalation too rapid. The private equity syndicate deadline was looming, and their attempts to contact me directly had failed. Now they were weaponizing my father's health, orchestrating a crisis designed to bypass my boundaries and drag me back into their web. A heavy, sickening feeling settled in my stomach. The lengths they were willing to go to the depths of their manipulation were staggering. They were staging a life-or-death scenario, expecting me to drop everything, rush to the hospital, and fall into their waiting trap. I took a slow sip of coffee, the bitter warmth spreading through my chest. The hospital was there to reign. It was an environment designed to induce panic, compliance, and surrender. If I walked into that ICU, I would be walking into an ambush. But I also knew that ignoring a supposed medical emergency would give them the ultimate ammunition. They would paint me as the heartless, estranged daughter who abandoned her dying father. They would use that narrative to rally the rest of the extended family against me, creating a united front of condemnation. I had to respond, but I had to do it on my terms. I had to expose their bluff without getting caught in the blast radius. I walked back inside the cabin, picked up my keys, and headed for the door. I was going to Portland, but I was not going as a frightened, obedient daughter. I was going as the warden, ready to face the monsters they had become. The asphalt of the interstate blurred beneath my tires as I navigated the winding descent from the Cascade Range into the dense concrete grid of Portland. The rain had faded into a persistent gray mist coating the windshield in fine droplets. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my joints ache. The journey from the quiet sanctuary of my forest to the sprawling synthetic complex of Portland General felt like crossing a heavily fortified border into enemy territory. I knew I was driving into a trap. The frantic text message from my aunt had been perfectly orchestrated, timed to catch me off guard, just as the Shadow Syndicate deadline closed in on my brother. Yet the biological pull of a parent in peril is a deeply ingrained vulnerability. A small, irrational fraction of my mind whispered that perhaps the stress really had broken my father. Perhaps a genuine health crisis had stripped away his greed, leaving only a fragile mortal man. I had to know for certain. I had to look them in the eyes one last time before severing the cord forever. The cardiac intensive care unit hummed with a sterile, calculated efficiency. The scent of industrial bleach latex and rubbing alcohol stung my nostrils, a stark contrast to the rich, damp loam of my timberland. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the polished linoleum floors. I walked past rooms filled with the quiet murmur of medical staff and the low drone of ventilators. My mother waited near the central nurses' station. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat over a pristine blouse. Her hair remained impeccably styled, though she clutched a crumpled white tissue in her hand. It was a flawless visual prop. When she saw me approaching, her posture slumped. The formidable, icy matriarch vanished, replaced by the image of a devastated, trembling wife. "Diana," she breathed, her voice cracking in a masterful display of theatrical grief. She stepped forward and threw her arms around my shoulders. I stood rigid, my arms pinned to my sides. Her perfume was overwhelming in the sterile hospital air. The embrace felt hollow, a strategic maneuver rather than an expression of comfort. "He is stable for now," Abigail whispered, pulling back just enough to look at my face. Her eyes were rimmed with a faint strategic red, but her mascara remained entirely unsmudged. The doctors said it was a severe, stress-induced cardiac event. His blood pressure spiked to catastrophic levels. "He has been so worried about the family fracturing, Diana. He has not slept in days. The fear of losing you, of losing everything we built, it just broke his heart." The guilt trip was subtle, woven seamlessly into the medical update. She was painting me as the architect of his physical collapse. I kept my face neutral, absorbing the performance without offering a single word of validation. "Take me to his room," I said, my tone flat. Abigail offered a brave, tragic nod and led me down the quiet corridor. Room 412 was dim. The blinds were drawn against the afternoon light. My father lay in the hospital bed, propped up by thin pillows. An intravenous line snaked into the back of his hand. The rhythmic, piercing beep of an electrocardiogram provided a cinematic soundtrack to the scene, echoing off the bare walls. Charles looked pale, his skin possessing a waxy, unnatural sheen. But as I stepped into the room, his eyes darted toward the doorway. The gaze that met mine was not clouded by painkillers or fatigue. It was sharp, focused, and calculating. He was a predator, resting in a snare, waiting for the prey to step closer. "Diana," he murmured, his voice adopting a weak, raspy quality that did not match the intense clarity in his eyes. "You came." I stood at the foot of the bed, keeping a calculated physical distance. "I am here, Charles." He closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. I thought I was losing everything today. When my chest tightened, when the room started spinning, all I could think about was how fractured we have become. We cannot keep fighting like this. Life is too fragile. We need to protect each other. We need to protect the legacy. My mother moved to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. She looked at me, her expression shifting from sorrow to a practiced, urgent pragmatism. "Your father is right," Abigail said. "The doctors warned us that any further stress could trigger a second fatal event. He needs rest. He needs to step away from the holding company and the estate logistics immediately. But the corporate machine does not stop just because a man is in a hospital bed. We have vendors to pay, emergency medical directives to establish, and urgent family assets to shield during his recovery." She reached into the leather tote bag resting on the visitor chair. She pulled out a thick wooden clipboard holding a stack of crisp legal documents. She walked around the bed and extended the clipboard toward me along with a black ballpoint pen. "Mr. Higgins drafted this an hour ago," Abigail explained, her voice quickening, adopting the smooth cadence of a seasoned salesperson closing a deal. "It is an emergency family proxy directive. Since your father is incapacitated, the hospital and our corporate partners require all direct heirs to sign a unified medical and administrative proxy. It just designates me as the sole decision-maker for the family estate while he is in the ICU. It ensures there are no legal bottlenecks with his care or our accounts." I looked at the clipboard. I looked at the pen. The memory of the Portland boardroom crashed over me, a vivid, suffocating parallel. A week ago, they had tried to erase me with a waiver of contest. Today, they were trying a different route, cloaking their greed in the sterile language of hospital administration. "It is just a standard formality, Diana," my father rasped from the bed, echoing the exact phrase he had used in the boardroom. "Sign it so I can finally rest." I took the clipboard. I did not take the pen. I looked down at the top sheet. The header read, "Emergency Healthcare and Administrative Proxy," in bold, reassuring letters. The first page was filled with standard medical jargon clauses, granting Abigail the authority to approve surgeries, access medical records, and manage hospital billing. It looked innocuous. It looked like the paperwork of a frightened family preparing for the worst. I flipped to the second page. Abigail shifted her weight, the sole of her designer shoe squeaking faintly against the linoleum. "We really need to get that filed with the charge nurse before the shift change." She pressed a subtle edge of impatience bleeding through her mournful facade. I ignored her. I ran my index finger down the dense blocks of text on page 2. The medical terminology began to fade, replaced by the cold, precise vocabulary of estate law. I reached the fourth paragraph. The text read, "The signatory hereby grants Abigail Ford general, durable power of attorney, including irrevocable financial conservatorship over all individual trusts, real property, and distinct assets held by the signatory. This proxy supersedes all prior trust designations and allows the proxy holder to liquidate, transfer, or leverage said assets to maintain the financial stability of the primary familial estate." The breath caught in my throat. It was not a medical proxy. It was a Trojan horse. Buried inside the routine hospital paperwork was a sweeping draconian conservatorship clause. If I signed my name at the bottom of that page, I would be legally granting my mother total control over my life. I would be handing her the keys to the irrevocable trust. With a single signature, Abigail would have the legal authority to seize the 3,000 acres of Oregon timberland, liquidate the ancient forest, and funnel every cent of the $14 million directly to Nolan Shadow Syndicate creditors. They had weaponized a cardiac ward. They had staged a health crisis banked on my biological empathy and tried to trick me into signing away my grandfather's sanctuary while standing at the foot of a hospital bed. The sheer, breathtaking depravity of the maneuver extinguished whatever lingering sympathy I held for the man in the bed. I looked up from the clipboard. I met my mother's gaze. The feigned sorrow had vanished from her face, replaced by a tense, breathless anticipation. She was waiting for the ink to touch the paper. She was waiting for the trap to snap shut. I let go of the clipboard. It dropped from my hands, striking the hard linoleum floor with a sharp, violent crack. The plastic clip shattered, sending the thick stack of fraudulent legal documents scattering across the sterile room. Abigail jumped, her eyes widening in genuine shock. "Diana, what are you doing?" I looked at the electrocardiogram monitor next to the bed. My father's heart rate was a steady, rhythmic 70 beats per minute. His blood pressure numbers displayed on the screen were remarkably normal for a man supposedly hovering on the brink of a fatal cardiac event. The machine confirmed what the paperwork had already proven. "You are not dying, Charles," I said, my voice echoing off the bare walls, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You are just out of options." My father dropped the weakened, raspy act. He sat up straighter against the pillows, his face flushing a dark, furious red. "Pick up the paper, Diana," he commanded, his voice booming through the small room. I took a step backward, moving toward the door. "I am leaving," I said, "and if you ever try to contact me again, if you ever send another fraudulent legal document my way, I will hand Veronica Cole the entire dossier on Nolan wire fraud. I will let the federal government dismantle this family brick by brick." My mother lunged forward, stepping over the scattered papers, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "You cannot walk away from us. We are your blood." "Blood is just a biological accident, Abigail," I replied, my hand finding the heavy metal handle of the hospital door. "Loyalty is earned, and you bankrupted yours a long time ago." I pushed the door open and stepped out into the bright, humming corridor of the ICU. I did not look back. I walked past the nurses' station, past the waiting rooms filled with families holding on to genuine grief, and headed straight for the exit. I pushed through the sliding glass doors and out into the cool, rain-washed Portland air. I took a deep, grounding breath. The emotional chains that had tethered me to their judgment for 3 decades were finally, permanently severed. They had played their final psychological card and lost. But as I walked across the wet asphalt toward my truck, a new, sharper tension settled over my shoulders. They were out of social leverage. They were out of emotional manipulation. They were out of legal loopholes. A predator with no escape route does not surrender. It turns feral. The sophisticated corporate games were over. Now they were going to do something desperate, reckless, and highly illegal. The real danger was no longer hidden in the fine print. It was coming straight for the deed. The drive back to the Willamette Valley felt like surfacing from a deep, suffocating trench. Leaving the sterile fluorescent glare of the Portland hospital behind, I watched the concrete sprawl yield to the towering silhouettes of the Cascade Range. The tension in my shoulders began to unspool with every mile. I had walked into their ultimate psychological ambush and walked out with my boundaries intact. My parents had played their final emotional card, faking a life-threatening crisis to steal my inheritance, and they had failed. The next morning, the air on my property was crisp, smelling of crushed pine needles and wet earth. A dense fog clung to the upper ridges of the forest. Down in the valley, the heavy, rhythmic hum of industrial machinery vibrated through the ground. Elias Thorne and his sustainable forestry crew had arrived at dawn. I stood on the wraparound porch of my cabin, wrapping both hands around a steaming mug of black coffee. The distant whine of chainsaws and the deep rumble of diesel engines represented a symphony of independence. Elias was executing the surgical harvest we had planned, clearing out the diseased secondary growth to let the ancient canopy breathe. The initial deposit rested safely in my bank account, securing my financial fortress. My consulting business was booked solid. For the first time in 32 years, my future felt unassailable. Then the machinery stopped. It did not taper off gradually. The engines cut out in a sudden, jarring sequence, leaving behind an unnatural, ringing silence that echoed off the mountain walls. I lowered my coffee mug. The quiet stretched for 5 minutes, then 10. A deep, primal instinct flared in my chest. A forest crew does not halt production mid-morning unless an accident has occurred or an external force has intervened. A silver pickup truck emerged from the tree line, its tires kicking up gravel as it sped down the winding dirt road toward my cabin. Elias slammed the truck into park before it had fully stopped rolling. He stepped out of the cab, his face tight, his heavy work boots crunching against the stones. He held a thick stack of legal documents printed on bright yellow paper. "We have to shut it down, Diana," Elias said, his voice clipped and professional, though his eyes betrayed genuine frustration. I set my mug on the wooden railing. "Did someone get hurt?" "No," he replied, marching up the porch steps and handing me the yellow papers. "The county sheriff drove up the access road 10 minutes ago. He served me with a stop work order." I took the documents, my eyes scanning the bold, aggressive black text. It was a formal legal injunction. Attached to the county order was a secondary filing from the Portland District Court, a notice of lis pendens. My stomach dropped. A lis pendens is a notice of pending litigation. It is a legal red flag hammered directly into a property deed, signaling to the world that the title is under dispute. It effectively freezes the land. No bank will finance it, no buyer will purchase it, and no contractor can legally extract resources from it until the lawsuit is resolved. I read the plaintiff name printed at the top of the filing. Nolan Ford. "He filed a claim against the deed," Elias explained, crossing his arms over his flannel shirt. "He is alleging that the 3,000 acres were purchased using embezzled funds from your father holding company. He is claiming the trust is an illicit asset and must be frozen pending a full forensic audit." "It is a lie," I said, my voice cold and hard. "Theodore purchased this acreage 40 years ago, decades before the holding company even incorporated. The financial records prove it." "I believe you," Elias said, his tone softening slightly. "But the county does not care about proof right now. They only care about liability. If I cut another tree on a clouded title, my firm could be sued for resource theft. My buyers will not touch the timber. The mills will not process it. I cannot risk my crew or my business. I have to pull my equipment off the mountain until you clear this up." I watched Elias drive his truck back up the ridge to recall his workers. The silence of the forest returned, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a siege. I walked into my cabin and spread the yellow documents across my kitchen table. The legal maneuvering was sloppy drafted by an attorney operating out of a strip mall in a Portland suburb. It lacked the refined, lethal precision of the corporate lawyers my family usually employed. The prominent firms refused to touch a case this fraudulent, so Nolan had scraped the bottom of the barrel. He found a desperate lawyer willing to file a baseless claim for a quick retainer fee. The strategy was brutally transparent. Nolan did not need to win the lawsuit. He only needed to freeze the board. In the American civil justice system, filing a claim takes an hour and a few $100s. Getting a fraudulent claim dismissed takes months. Nolan knew the courts were backlogged. He knew it would take 30 to 60 days just to get a judge to review the initial filings. He was using the slow grind of the legal system as a chokehold. With the land frozen, the logging operation would cease. The revenue stream I was using to pay my defamation attorney and cover the upcoming property taxes would evaporate. He was trying to starve me out. My phone vibrated against the table. The screen displayed a restricted number. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear without speaking. Diana. It was Nolan. His voice was unrecognizable. The smooth, arrogant cadence of the tech visionary had vanished. He sounded feral. His breathing was ragged, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed rush. He sounded like a man who had not slept in days. A man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. "You saw the filing," Nolan whispered. The audio crackled with static, suggesting he was calling from a burner phone. "I saw a desperate piece of fiction," I replied smoothly. "It works," he shot back, his voice pitching higher. "It stops the logging. It stops everything. You cannot move a single branch off that mountain. You are paralyzed. The Shadow Syndicate deadline must be breathing down his neck. The federal investigators must be tightening their net." He was a cornered animal, lashing out with blind, terrified aggression. "Drop the act, Diana," he pleaded, his tone shifting rapidly from threatening to begging. "You do not understand the people I owe. You do not understand what they will do to me. I have nothing left. The startup is gone. Tiffany left me. Dad lost his leverage. This is all I have." "You did this to yourself, Nolan. You chose to commit fraud. You chose to borrow money from predators."
"I do not care about fault right now,"
he yelled, the panic tearing through his vocal cords. "I care about surviving. You have $14 million sitting in the dirt. I only need 4. Sign the deed over to the holding company. Do it today, and I will drop the lawsuit. I will lift the freeze. You can keep your little cabin, you can keep consulting, but if you fight me on this, I will drag this litigation out for years. I will drown you in legal fees until the county seizes your land for unpaid taxes. We can both lose everything. It is your choice." He was holding a match over a barrel of gasoline, threatening to burn us both alive if I did not hand him the extinguisher. I did not raise my voice. I did not betray a single ounce of fear. "You think you are playing a game of leverage, Nolan," I said, keeping my words slow and deliberate. "But you are just playing a game of checkers on a board you do not understand. Do not ever call this number again." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thud. I did not feel the old anxiety, the conditioned panic of a scapegoat trying to fix the family mess. I felt the sharp, cold edge of a surgeon preparing to amputate a necrotic limb. I picked up the phone and dialed Veronica Cole. My attorney answered immediately. I summarized the situation, detailing the stop work order, the lis pendens, and the frantic voicemail Nolan had just delivered. I expected Veronica to sigh, to warn me about the long, grueling months of civil litigation ahead. Instead, I heard the faint rustle of heavy paper through the receiver. "Email me a photograph of the plaintiff filing," Veronica instructed, her voice tightening with a sudden predatory focus. I snapped a picture of the yellow document and sent it. I heard the ping of her inbox receiving the file. A heavy silence stretched over the line for a full minute. I could picture Veronica sitting at her obsidian desk, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the sloppy legal text drafted by Nolan's strip mall lawyer. "He filed the claim against the trust itself," Veronica said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, carrying a tone of absolute, unvarnished astonishment. "Is that a problem?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "For you, no," Veronica replied. "For your brother and your father, it is catastrophic." She explained the mechanics of the blunder. Nolan was too panicked, and his discount lawyer was too incompetent to understand the architecture of what Theodore had built. They assumed the trust was just a standard holding vessel. They assumed filing a lien was a standard real estate maneuver. "I am pulling the original foundational document your grandfather drafted 10 years ago." Veronica said, the sound of her keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "Theodore Ford was a paranoid, brilliant man. He did not just build a vault for you. He installed a tripwire." She paused, reading a specific paragraph aloud. "Should any heir attempt to legally encumber, contest, or defraud another beneficiary inheritance, they automatically forfeit all remaining trust benefits and board seats." The words echoed in the quiet cabin. The implications hit me with the force of a freight train. Nolan did not just freeze my timberland. By launching a hostile, fraudulent legal claim against the overarching trust estate, he had launched a direct attack on the structural integrity of Theodore legacy. He had triggered the defense mechanism. "Your father authorized this attack," Veronica said, her voice ringing with grim satisfaction. "Charles allowed Nolan to use the holding company name in the filing. They stepped on the landmine I breathed. And I am about to detonate it," Veronica said. "I am filing an emergency injunction with the federal court. By the time the sun sets today, your father will wish he never handed your brother a pen." The silence in the cabin was broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the glass. Veronica's words hung in the air, electric and sharp. My grandfather had not just built a shield. He had installed a trap door, and my family had marched right onto it. "I am drafting the emergency injunction now," Veronica continued, the rapid clicking of her keyboard, underscoring her urgency. "We are going to file this in federal court before the county even processes the ink on Nolan's lis pendens. Theodore's trust was registered under federal jurisdiction to bypass local probate interference. They thought they were dealing with a simple county property dispute. They are about to get hit by a federal mandate." A profound sense of awe washed over me. I looked at the carved piece of Oregon white oak on my desk. Theodore had anticipated their every move. He knew the depth of their greed and the exact sequence of their desperation. He knew Charles would try to break the trust, and he knew Charles would use Nolan as the hammer. "The coercion clause is explicit," Veronica explained, her tone shifting into full litigator mode. "It states that any attempt to encumber, contest, or defraud the trust automatically triggers a forfeiture of all remaining benefits and board seats for the offending party and anyone conspiring with them. Nolan filed the claim, but he used the holding company's name as a secondary plaintiff to legitimize it. Charles signed off on it." "He authorized the attack," I said, the reality solidifying. "Exactly," Veronica confirmed. "And by doing so, Charles triggered his own forfeiture. The Chekhov's gun loaded in the Portland boardroom 2 weeks ago had just fired." I remembered my father leaning back in his Italian leather chair, boasting about his indispensable role on the holding company board. I remembered his arrogant smirk as he discussed his $250,000 annual retainer and his plans to restructure the executive team. That board seat was his identity. It was the source of his country club prestige, his influence over the Willamette Valley Agricultural Network, and his most lucrative, consistent stream of income. He had built his entire public persona around the illusion of being a corporate titan, and now, because he tried to steal the land his father gave me, that identity was gone, vaporized by a single clause in a document he had desperately underestimated. "How fast does the forfeiture take effect?" I asked, a cool sense of anticipation settling over me. "The injunction triggers an immediate suspension," Veronica said. I am sending a courier to the holding company's general counsel with the federal filing. The board will be legally obligated to freeze Charles's access, suspend his voting rights, and halt his retainer payments immediately to comply with the trust's charter. If they don't, they risk federal liability. They will cut him off, I said, knowing the board members' primary loyalty was to their own wealth, not my father's ego. Within the hour, Veronica promised. Your father is going to find out he is unemployed before he sits down for lunch. The execution was swift and merciless. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing the logging contracts with Elias, assuring him the county freeze would be lifted shortly. The federal injunction superseded the local stop work order. We were just waiting for the bureaucratic machinery to process the override. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was not Nolan, and it was not my mother. The caller ID displayed the main switchboard number for the holding company's corporate headquarters in downtown Portland. I let it ring twice before answering. Diana. The voice on the other end was Charles, but it was hollowed out, stripped of its booming resonance. He sounded like a man who had just watched his house burn to the ground. You called the board, he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation layered in shock. Veronica Cole filed a federal injunction, I corrected calmly. You and Nolan triggered the coercion clause. The board is simply complying with the law. I heard a sharp, ragged intake of breath. They locked me out of the executive portal. Charles whispered, the disbelief vibrating through the line. The general counsel called me 5 minutes ago. They suspended my retainer. They told me I am barred from the building until the litigation is resolved. The litigation you authorized, I reminded him. You let Nolan file a fraudulent lien against the trust. You tried to freeze my assets. I was trying to save my son, Charles yelled, the panic finally breaking through the shock. The volume peaked, distorting the audio. I was trying to stop him from going to federal prison. You think a board seat matters compared to that? We needed the land, Diana. We needed the capital to pay off the syndicate. You have doomed him. Nolan doomed himself when he committed wire fraud, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. And you doomed yourself when you tried to use me as a human shield. You thought you could just take what you wanted because you never respected me enough to believe I would fight back. You are destroying this family. Charles choked out the sound of desperation thick in his throat. I am surviving it, I replied, and ended the call. I set the phone down. The satisfaction was there, but it was complex, tinged with the sorrow of realizing how little I meant to them. They were willing to burn everything to the ground to maintain their illusions. The loss of his board seat was not just a financial blow to Charles. It was the total annihilation of his ego. The power he had wielded over me, the leverage he had used to threaten my consulting business, was entirely gone. He was no longer a corporate titan. He was an unemployed man facing the catastrophic fallout of his son's crimes. But a predator with a broken leg is still dangerous. The loss of the board seat meant the primary holding company was no longer a viable source of capital to bail Nolan out. The $6 million estate was still tied up in probate, untouchable for months. The syndicate's deadline remained. They were out of money, out of leverage, and out of time. The toxic alliance that had sustained their family dynamic for decades was beginning to buckle under the immense pressure. When narcissists realize they can no longer control the narrative or their victims, they inevitably turn on each other. The implosion started quietly, but the shockwaves reached the Willamette Valley faster than I anticipated. David called me the next morning with the latest dispatch from the Portland gossip mill. The news of Charles's sudden, unceremonious suspension from the board had leaked. High society runs on rumors, and a titan falling from grace is prime currency. But the real casualty of the fallout was not my father's reputation. It was Nolan's marriage. Tiffany had endured the humiliation of the cease and desist letter, accepting the demotion at her public relations firm, because she believed Nolan's inheritance would eventually provide a golden parachute. She had tethered her identity to the promise of the $6 million estate and the luxurious coastal mansion. But when Charles lost his board seat, the reality of the situation crashed down on her. The holding company was no longer a safety net. The syndicate debt was real, and it was immediate. The federal investigation was no longer a distant threat. It was a looming reality. The vapor she had built her life around was finally dissipating, leaving only the wreckage. According to David, Tiffany did not leave quietly. She orchestrated a spectacular scorched earth departure. She packed her designer luggage, hired a moving company, and vacated the pristine condo while Nolan was out frantically trying to secure a high-risk loan. She did not just leave her husband. She launched a preemptive strike to salvage her own shredded reputation. She called her high society contacts, the same people she had lied to about me, and loudly blamed my parents. She painted Abigail as an enabling, toxic mother who had ruined Nolan by coddling him and hiding his financial incompetence. She framed Charles as a desperate, corrupt executive who had dragged the family into legal ruin. She weaponized their own tactics against them, ensuring she looked like a victim fleeing a sinking ship. The golden child's marriage had collapsed. The patriarch's career was destroyed. The matriarch's social standing was in ruins. I stood on my porch watching Elias Thorne's crew return to the mountain. The county sheriff had lifted the stop work order after receiving the federal mandate. The chainsaws roared back to life, their harsh metallic bite echoing through the valley. The harvest had resumed. The fortress was secure, but the war was not over. My family had lost their power, their money, and their alliances. But they still had their rage. Cornered, humiliated, and facing total ruin, Charles was preparing one final, desperate assault. He was going to use the only weapon he had left, launching a legal strike, so reckless it would force a final confrontation. The boardroom had been the opening skirmish. The mediation table was going to be the slaughterhouse. The collapse of a dynasty does not happen in a single deafening crash. It fractures along the fault lines, splintering piece by piece until the foundation gives way. For my family, that foundation had always been the illusion of flawless, impenetrable wealth. Once my grandfather's trust triggered the forfeiture of my father's board seat, that illusion shattered, leaving them exposed to a reality they lacked the spine to survive. I watched the fallout from the quiet safety of the Cascade Range. The Willamette Valley Gossip Network proved far more efficient than any corporate press release. The details of Tiffany's departure arrived via David, who had heard the story from a catering director working a brunch in the Pearl District. Tiffany did not just leave my brother. She orchestrated a spectacular scorched earth exit designed to salvage her own shredded reputation by immolating his. She hired a premium moving company to clear out her half of their luxury condominium on a Sunday morning, precisely when the building lobby was packed with their affluent neighbors returning from church and weekend retreats. When Abigail received the frantic call from Nolan, she rushed across town to intervene. My mother expected to use her icy matriarchal authority to bring her rogue daughter-in-law back into line. She expected compliance. Instead, she walked into a public slaughterhouse. Standing in the center of the marble lobby, surrounded by leather sofas and wide-eyed valets, Tiffany turned her sights on my mother. She did not lower her voice. She projected it. Tiffany blamed Abigail for every failure Nolan had ever committed. She laid bare the coddling, the endless financial bailouts, and the toxic enabling that had produced a 30-year-old man incapable of telling the truth. She loudly disclosed the impending federal investigation into Nolan's startup, ensuring every neighbor in earshot understood that the Golden Child was a fraud facing prison time. She declared that she refused to be dragged down by a family of corrupt, arrogant liars. Abigail stood paralyzed. The woman who had spent decades meticulously cultivating a pristine social image was publicly humiliated, stripped bare in front of the exact demographic she sought to impress. Tiffany stepped into a waiting black car and vanished, leaving my mother standing alone in the lobby, clutching her designer handbag as the whispers began to echo off the marble walls. The alliance was dead. The Golden Child's marriage was over. But the social humiliation was merely a symptom of the terminal disease infecting my father's bank accounts. Charles was entirely cut off from the holding company. His retainer was frozen. His access cards were deactivated. He could no longer leverage corporate assets to shield Nolan from the Shadow Syndicate. The deadline for the $4 million debt was approaching with the speed of an uncoupled freight train, and the federal investigators were tightening their net around Nolan's fabricated tech startup. A cornered predator does not care about strategy. It only cares about survival. 4 days after the lobby incident, Veronica Cole summoned me back to Portland. I sat in her sleek office looking out over the gray skyline as she slid a thick-bound legal folder across her obsidian desk. Charles filed a petition to dissolve the trust, Veronica said. Her voice lacked its usual sharp edge, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. I frowned, resting my hands on the cool leather of my chair. We already proved he triggered the coercion clause. He lost his standing. He is not attacking the mechanics of the trust this time, Veronica explained. He is attacking the architect. He is claiming that Theodore lacked testamentary capacity when he signed the documents 10 years ago. He filed a sworn affidavit alleging that your grandfather suffered from severe, undocumented dementia, that his mind was failing, and that you used your proximity on the farm to exert undue influence over a vulnerable elder. The sheer audacity of the lie sent a spike of cold fury through my chest. They were projecting their own predatory behavior onto me. Can he even get a judge to hear this? I asked. Not immediately, Veronica said. But because the allegation involves medical capacity and a multi-million-dollar estate, the federal court mandates a formal mediation process before it allows the case to proceed to the trial docket. He is banking on the fact that you will want to avoid a public, grueling court battle. He thinks if he drags you into a room and threatens to tie the land up in a decade of litigation, you will settle. He wants you to buy him out to make him go away. I looked down at the petition. The plaintiff's signatures at the bottom belonged to Charles and Nolan. They were fighting for their literal freedom using the only weapon they had left. When is the mediation? I asked. Tomorrow morning, Veronica replied. The arbitration firm occupied the top floor of a high-rise in the financial district. The conference room was a marvel of intimidation, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a dizzying view of the city below. A massive, polished granite table dominated the space. The room smelled of stale espresso and nervous sweat. I walked in flanked by Veronica Cole and Arthur Caldwell. I wore a simple, tailored charcoal blazer and dark trousers. I felt grounded, centered by the knowledge that the soil of the sanctuary belonged to me, regardless of the fiction my father was attempting to spin. We took our seats on the left side of the granite table. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors opened, and the remnants of my family walked in. I barely recognized them. The physical toll of the past 3 weeks was etched into their faces like acid burns. My father's bespoke suit hung loosely from his frame, the collar gapping around his neck. The arrogant, booming corporate titan was gone. He looked gaunt, his skin possessing a dull, grayish pallor. Dark, heavy bags shadowed his eyes. My mother walked in beside him. Abigail's posture was rigid, but it was a brittle stiffness like a dry branch ready to snap under the slightest pressure. Her flawless makeup could not hide the deep lines of exhaustion framing her mouth. She refused to meet my gaze, staring fixedly at the center of the granite table. And then there was Nolan. My brother looked physically ill. He slumped into the leather chair, his hands resting on the table. His fingers trembled with a subtle, continuous vibration. He kept glancing down at his cell phone, his eyes darting frantically toward the dark screen, waiting for a call from a federal agent or a ruthless creditor. The swaggering tech visionary who had smugly offered to hire me to pull weeds was dead. In his place sat a terrified, hollowed-out shell of a man, staring over the edge of a cliff. They had hired a new attorney, a sharp-featured man named Vance, who carried the distinct aggressive energy of a litigator who billed by the minute and specialized in scorched earth tactics. The mediator, a retired federal judge with a stern, impassive face, took his seat at the head of the table. He outlined the rules of engagement, emphasizing that the goal was to find a resolution before the court intervened. Vance did not waste a single second. He launched into a fiery, calculated opening statement. "My clients are here to correct a grievous injustice," Vance began, his voice echoing off the glass walls. 10 years ago, Theodore Ford was an elderly man living in isolation. His mental faculties were in sharp decline. He was suffering from memory lapses and paranoia. Diana Ford, exploiting her position as his sole regular contact on her remote farm, isolated him further from his loving son and grandson. She manipulated a sick, confused old man into signing an irrevocable trust that stripped the primary estate of its most valuable asset. Vance leaned forward, pressing his palms against the granite. "We are prepared to bring forth medical experts who will testify to the predictable cognitive decline of a man his age. We will subpoena the records. We will tie this property up in federal court until the timber rots. Or we can reach an equitable settlement today." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Veronica. "My clients are willing to drop the lawsuit, dissolve the trust, and accept a 50% liquidation share of the Oregon timberland," Vance stated. "Diana retains half the value, and the family is made whole." I looked at the piece of paper. Then I looked at my father. Charles was staring at me, his eyes wide and desperate, silently pleading with me to take the lifeline. He needed those $7 million to pay off the syndicate and hire a criminal defense team for Nolan. He was trying to extort his own daughter to clean up a crime scene he had helped conceal. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The mediator looked toward our side of the table, expecting Veronica to present a counteroffer. He expected a negotiation. He expected the traditional dance of legal compromise. I did not touch the piece of paper. I did not blink. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their final maneuver. They truly believed they could bully me into surrendering half my grandfather's legacy based on a fabricated medical diagnosis. Veronica sat back in her chair. She did not look at the settlement offer. Instead, she turned her head and offered a slight deferential nod to Arthur Caldwell. The older attorney adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit. He reached down and opened his battered leather briefcase. The brass locks clicked with a sharp final sound that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The sharp, metallic snap of Caldwell unlocking his battered leather briefcase severed the suffocating tension in the arbitration room. The sound echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, drawing every eye toward our side of the polished granite table. Before Caldwell could retrieve his documents, the opposing counsel, a sharp-featured litigator hired by my father, leaned forward to interject. The man possessed the eager, predatory energy of someone who believed he held the winning hand. He slid a bound folder across the smooth stone surface toward the retired federal judge, acting as our mediator. "We have secured a sworn affidavit from a prominent behavioral specialist," the opposing counsel announced, his voice ringing with manufactured confidence. The physician reviewed Theodore Ford medical history, cross-referenced with witness testimonies provided by my clients regarding his erratic behavior during his final years. The specialist is prepared to testify under oath that Theodore exhibited classic, undeniable markers of advanced cognitive decay. This post-mortem analysis confirms he lacked the mental capacity to execute complex estate modifications. I stared at the folder resting in the center of the table. A cold wave of disgust washed over me. My father had actually found a corrupt physician willing to perjure himself for a cut of the settlement. They were attempting to rewrite history, painting a brilliant, fiercely independent man as a confused victim. All to steal the land he had protected. Charles sat perfectly rigid, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He was waiting for me to crack. He expected the threat of a grueling public trial featuring hired medical mercenaries to break my resolve. He needed me to reach across the table, accept the 50% settlement, and save him from the shadow syndicate breathing down his neck. Veronica Cole did not touch the folder. She did not even look at it. She simply leaned back in her chair and gestured gracefully toward Caldwell. The older estate attorney withdrew a sleek, silver flash drive from his briefcase. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting the overhead lights catch the metal. A post-mortem analysis based on hearsay is a fascinating legal strategy, Caldwell mused, his tone smooth and entirely devoid of concern. However, it is woefully insufficient when confronted with contemporary empirical evidence. Caldwell turned his attention to the mediator. "Your Honor, I request permission to utilize the audiovisual equipment integrated into this conference room. I have a piece of evidence that will render the plaintiff's entire petition moot and save the court a tremendous amount of wasted docket time." The retired judge nodded, pressing a button on a small control panel embedded in the granite table. A large motorized screen descended silently from the ceiling at the far end of the room. The automated blinds lowered over the glass walls, blocking out the dizzying view of the financial district and plunging the space into a cool, cinematic gloom. The opposing counsel frowned, his confident posture faltering slightly. "What exactly is on that drive?" he demanded. "The truth," Caldwell replied softly. He plugged the flash drive into the table port. The projector hummed to life, throwing a bright rectangular beam across the room. A date stamp appeared in the bottom right corner of the screen in stark white text. The date was exactly 10 years ago, marking the precise week my grandfather had driven away from my farm in the pouring Oregon rain. The image resolved into a crisp, high-definition recording. Theodore sat in a comfortable armchair inside a brightly lit clinical office. He wore his favorite tweed jacket, his posture straight and commanding. His pale gray eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Surrounding him were 3 distinguished individuals wearing white coats, each holding digital tablets. I recognized the setting immediately. It was the neurology department of a premier research hospital in Seattle, a facility renowned for its rigorous cognitive assessment programs. For the record, a woman off camera spoke, her voice crisp and professional. "We are conducting a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation of Mr. Theodore Ford. This assessment is being administered independently by 3 board-certified specialists to establish undeniable testamentary capacity." On our side of the table, I heard a sharp intake of breath. I glanced across the granite surface. My father's face had drained of all remaining color. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray. Beside him, Nolan stopped breathing entirely, his frantic trembling freezing into a state of sheer paralysis. The video played out like a masterclass in intellectual dominance. For the next several minutes, the mediator and the opposing counsel watched in stunned silence as my grandfather effortlessly navigated a battery of complex cognitive puzzles. Theodore recalled intricate financial details regarding his holding company, reciting specific stock valuations, market trends, and property acreages from memory without missing a single beat. His humor was dry and biting. His lucidity was absolute, undeniable, and blindingly clear. The hired psychiatrist affidavit was instantly pulverized. No judge in the country would entertain a speculative post-mortem diagnosis when confronted with a 3-hour, multidisciplinary video assessment confirming peak mental fitness. The opposing counsel sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. He realized in real time that he had walked into a fatal legal trap. By submitting a fraudulent medical affidavit, he had jeopardized his own license. The case was dead, and his career was suddenly on the line. On the screen, the 3 specialists concluded their examination. They thanked Theodore for his time, formally declaring him to be in the top percentile of cognitive health for his age bracket. The doctors began to gather their tablets, preparing to exit the frame. "Leave the camera rolling," Theodore instructed them, his low rumble echoing through the quiet arbitration room. "Give me a moment alone." The doctors obliged, stepping out of the room and closing the door behind them. Theodore shifted in his armchair, leaning forward until his face filled the center of the screen. He looked directly into the lens. The intensity of his gaze was piercing, bridging the 10-year gap and pinning my father to his chair. "Charles," my grandfather said. My father flinched as if a physical blow had landed across his jaw. He shrank down, trying to escape the judgment radiating from the projector screen. "If you are watching this," Theodore continued, his voice steady and resolute, "it means you have tried to break the vault. It means you have tried to steal the sanctuary from the only person in our bloodline who actually understands its value." My mother closed her eyes, turning her head away from the screen, unable to bear the weight of the undeniable truth. "I built the holding company to provide for this family," Theodore said. "But I watched it turn you into a parasite. I watched you measure your own worth by the things you could consume. And I watched you try to mold Nolan into the exact same shape. You spent your life extracting value, Charles. You never learned how to plant a single seed." Theodore paused, his expression softening just a fraction as he seemingly looked past the camera, envisioning the muddy fields of the Willamette Valley. "Diana knows how to build," Theodore declared. "She knows how to weather a storm without losing her roots. She has more integrity in her calloused hands than you possess in your entire corporate empire." The silence in the arbitration room was profound. The only sound was the faint, desperate wheezing of my brother trying to force air into his panicked lungs. My grandfather leaned closer to the camera, delivering his final, devastating mandate. "If Charles contests this trust," Theodore stated, his tone carrying the uncompromising weight of a judge issuing a final verdict, "it is born of his own greed. Diana is my sole rightful heir to the timberland. She owes you nothing. Let her live in peace." The video ended. The screen faded to a deep, featureless black. The automated blinds hummed as they retracted, allowing the harsh afternoon sunlight to flood back into the room, illuminating the sheer devastation on the other side of the table. The lawsuit was over. The extortion attempt had failed spectacularly. The threat of a decade-long litigation battle vanished into thin air. The retired federal judge folded his hands on top of the granite desk. He looked at the opposing counsel, his expression stern and unforgiving. "I will be recommending that the district court dismiss this petition with extreme prejudice," the mediator announced. I strongly suggest you advise your clients to abandon any further legal action unless you wish to face sanctions for submitting a frivolous claim. The opposing counsel nodded mutely, already packing his briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of my family ruin. I looked at Charles. He sat slumped in his expensive suit, his chin resting on his chest, staring blankly at the polished stone. He had lost his board seat, his reputation, and his final desperate gamble. Nolan buried his face in his hands, letting out a quiet, pathetic sob as the reality of his looming federal indictment and the Shadow Syndicate debt finally crushed him. Abigail stared out the window, her pristine facade shattered into 1,000 unfixable pieces. They were broken. They had destroyed themselves trying to destroy me. I did not feel the urge to gloat. I did not demand an apology or unleash a final triumphant speech. The silence was far more powerful than any words I could offer. I stood up from my leather chair. I buttoned my charcoal blazer and picked up my bag. Veronica Cole and Arthur Caldwell stood with me, their expressions reflecting quiet, dignified victory. I looked at the ruins of my family one last time. I saw them clearly now, stripped of their power and their illusions. They were not monsters. They were just empty, tragic people who had traded their souls for vapor. I turned my back on them and walked out of the glass doors. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, leaving them behind forever, without saying a single word. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing me inside the stainless steel car. The silence that wrapped around me was absolute, yet it possessed a profound ringing quality. It was the sound of a battle ending. For 32 years, I had fought a phantom war against a family that demanded my submission in exchange for the basic dignity they never intended to provide. In a single afternoon, using the weapon my grandfather had forged in secret, that war had concluded. I leaned against the cool metal wall as the car descended. I felt lighter. The crushing, invisible gravity that had dictated my posture, my career choices, and my sense of self-worth had evaporated. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the disappointment. I was simply Diana Ford, the sole, unencumbered owner of the sanctuary. When I stepped out onto the rain-washed streets of downtown Portland, the city looked different. It did not look intimidating or overwhelming. It just looked like a place I used to know. I did not celebrate. I did not throw a party or call my friends to boast about my victory. Instead, I drove back to the Willamette Valley. I returned to the dirt, the rain, and the work. Over the next several months, the fallout from the arbitration room rippled outward, settling into a grim, unglamorous reality for the people I had left behind. I received the updates through Veronica Cole, who monitored the legal filings, and through the inescapable hum of the local agricultural gossip network. The primary estate, the $6 million my father and brother had fought so viciously to protect, was finally released from probate. But it did not save them. The moment the assets became liquid, the vultures descended. Nolan was indicted by the federal government for wire fraud and securities manipulation. The investigation had gathered too much momentum, and the evidence was too explicit. He avoided federal prison, but only by the narrowest of margins. He accepted a brutal plea deal that required full restitution to the defrauded investors. To meet the terms of the plea and avoid a lengthy sentence, the entirety of his inheritance was liquidated. The coastal mansion in Cannon Beach, the property he had smugly offered to let me landscape, was auctioned off at a significant loss. The diverse stock portfolios were sold, the cash immediately diverted to a federal restitution fund. But the federal government was not the only entity seeking repayment. The Shadow Syndicate, the unregulated private equity firm holding Nolan's $4 million debt, did not care about the plea deal. They moved in the moment the primary estate was depleted. With Nolan broke and terrified, the debt cascaded onto my father. Charles had lost his board seat and his retainer. His reputation in Portland was radioactive. To cover Nolan's remaining debt and keep his son safe from violent collections, Charles was forced to liquidate his own assets. He sold the sprawling, pristine house I had grown up in. He sold his vintage cars. He sold the country club memberships. He drained his retirement accounts. My parents moved from their gated community into a modest leased condominium on the outskirts of the city. The illusion of the corporate titan and the flawless high society matriarch shattered, completely replaced by the quiet, desperate reality of two people living on a severely restricted fixed income. They never reached out to me. There were no more manipulative text messages, no staged medical emergencies, no demands for reconciliation. The silence was final, built not on respect, but on the profound, humiliating realization that I was entirely out of their reach. As they shrank into obscurity, my world expanded. The selective logging contract with Elias Thorne yielded a phenomenal return. The extraction was careful, methodical, and deeply respectful of the ecosystem. We cleared the diseased underbrush, allowing the ancient Douglas firs to thrive. The revenue from the harvest not only covered the property taxes for the next decade, but it provided the capital I needed to scale my own vision. I stopped taking on small consulting jobs. I used the timberland profits to establish a massive, state-of-the-art agricultural research facility on the edge of the sanctuary. I hired a team of agronomists, soil scientists, and watershed specialists. We partnered with local universities, offering grants to students studying sustainable forestry and organic crop rotation. I built a life rooted in the very earth my family had dismissed. 2 years after the arbitration meeting, the research facility was fully operational. We had just secured a major partnership with the State Environmental Protection Agency, a contract that solidified our reputation as pioneers in sustainable land management. It was a crisp, clear morning in early November. The frost had settled over the valley, painting the evergreens in a delicate, shimmering white. I was sitting on the wraparound porch of my expanded cabin, reviewing the final schematics for a new irrigation testing site. A thermos of hot coffee sat beside me, its steam curling into the frigid air. Elias Thorne's heavy diesel truck pulled up the gravel driveway. He stepped out, holding a thick clipboard. We had recently contracted a new third-party property management firm to handle the perimeter maintenance of the 3,000 acres. The property was massive, requiring constant brush clearing and fire lane maintenance. Morning Diana, Elias called out, his breath pluming in the cold air. The new perimeter crew arrived about an hour ago. They are working the South Ridge, clearing out the deadfall from the recent storm. How do they look? I asked, taking a sip of coffee. They are moving slow, Elias admitted, walking up the porch steps. They seem inexperienced. The foreman looks like he has never swung a chainsaw in his life. But the management firm vouched for them, so we will see how they do. He handed me the clipboard. I need your signature to authorize the first invoice for the brush clearing crew. I took the clipboard, scanning the standard contractor invoice. The company name was generic something forgettable like Valley View Maintenance Solutions. I checked the hourly rates and the equipment rental fees. Everything looked standard. Then my eyes drifted down to the bottom of the page, to the section listing the on-site personnel. The foreman name was printed in stark black ink. Nolan Ford. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The name jumped off the page, carrying the weight of a ghost I thought I had buried. I looked at Elias. "Is this the foreman?" I asked, pointing to the name. Elias nodded, entirely unaware of the history attached to the ink. "Yeah, guy looks exhausted. He is down on the South Ridge right now, hacking away at the blackberry brambles." I handed the clipboard back to Elias. The signature line remained blank. "I will sign it after I inspect the work," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the shock reverberating through my chest. Elias shrugged, taking the clipboard. Fair enough. I will be at the research center if you need me. He walked back to his truck and drove off, leaving me alone on the porch. I stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at my cheeks. The poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect, too devastating to fully process. Nolan had avoided federal prison, but the plea deal and the syndicate debt had stripped him of everything. Without his startup, without his inheritance, and without the social safety net my parents used to provide, he had been forced to enter the real world. A world where you had to trade physical labor for a paycheck. He had started a manual labor contracting company. He was clearing brush. And through the blind, indifferent mechanics of a third-party management firm, he had been hired to clear brush on my land. The very land he had filed a fraudulent lawsuit to steal. The very land he had begged me to surrender. I walked down the steps of the porch, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. I did not take my truck. I walked. The hike to the South Ridge took 20 minutes. The air grew warmer as the sun rose higher, melting the frost off the pine needles. The scent of fresh-cut wood and bruised earth grew stronger the closer I got. I heard the whine of the chainsaw before I saw the crew. I crested the ridge and looked down into a shallow ravine. The perimeter crew consisted of 3 men. 2 of them were wrestling a large fallen branch out of the fire lane. The third man was struggling with a heavy-duty brush cutter. He wore thick canvas work pants, a high-visibility vest, and heavy boots. His face was smeared with mud and sweat. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the machinery. He swung the cutter awkwardly, attacking a thick wall of invasive blackberry brambles. The thorns caught his sleeves, dragging against the fabric. It was Nolan. He looked 10 years older than the man who had sat in the arbitration room. The arrogance, the pristine grooming, the effortless charm, it was all gone. He looked exhausted, defeated, and entirely ordinary. He was just a man working a grueling minimum-wage job in the mud. I stood behind a massive Douglas fir, perfectly concealed by the shadows of the ancient canopy. I was close enough to hear him grunting with exertion, close enough to see the strain corded in his neck. I watched him. I thought about the boardroom. I thought about him smirking, steepling his fingers, and offering to pay me an hourly wage to pull weeds at his coastal mansion. I thought about the sheer, cruel audacity of that moment. And now here he was, covered in mud, clearing the brush on my $14 million estate, working for a wage I would eventually sign off on. I did not step out from behind the tree. I did not announce my presence. I did not want to see the shock or the humiliation on his face. I did not need a dramatic confrontation to feel satisfied. The universe had balanced the scales with an irony so profound it required no commentary. I turned away from the ravine. I walked back up the ridge, leaving my brother to his labor in the mud. The forest closed in around me. The towering evergreens swaying gently in the morning breeze. I walked back to my cabin, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and sat on the porch. I looked out over the vast, thriving expanse of the sanctuary. My grandfather had been right. True wealth has roots. It cannot be faked, it cannot be stolen, and it cannot be destroyed by those who only know how to consume. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute, unbothered peace of a life built on solid ground. The war was over, the ghosts were gone, and the future was entirely my own. We often confuse a family's legacy with its ledger. In American culture especially, within the fiercely competitive corridors of modern success, there is a dangerous temptation to measure a family's worth by the height of its branches rather than the depth of its roots. We look at the sprawling estates, the prestigious board seats, the polished holiday cards, and we assume we are looking at success. But as the story of the Oregon timberland and the boardroom so violently and beautifully illustrates, a house built on vapor will always collapse when the wind changes, no matter how much gold you paint on the walls. When we look at Charles and Abigail, we see a cautionary tale that strikes at the very heart of traditional family responsibility. Parenting is not merely the act of providing. It is the sacred, heavy duty of shaping a human soul to withstand the harsh realities of the world. Charles and Abigail failed not because they lacked financial resources, but because they suffered from a profound lack of emotional awareness. They created a golden child in Nolan, shielding him from consequence, smoothing over his failures with their checkbooks, and teaching him that his worth was tethered entirely to his social status and bank account. In doing so, they did not protect him. They destroyed him. We often think that giving our children everything they desire is the ultimate expression of parental love. But providing unearned comfort without demanding personal accountability is the most insidious form of child neglect. It breeds a hollow, fragile entitlement that crumbles the exact moment the world finally says no. Nolan's descent into corporate fraud and his eventual humiliating fate of manual labor wasn't a tragedy of circumstance. It was the inevitable bitter harvest of the seeds his own parents planted. On the other side of that toxic coin is Diana, the scapegoat, the child forced to exist in the cold shadows of her brother's manufactured brilliance. As parents, the demand for fairness and honesty is paramount, yet it is so easily corrupted by our own unhealed egos. Charles and Abigail looked at Diana's hands calloused from working the earth and felt ashamed because her quiet, unglamorous integrity highlighted their own superficiality. But in their cruel dismissal of her, they inadvertently gave her the greatest gift of all, the absolute non-negotiable necessity of resilience. Because Diana was denied the easy path, she had to build her own foundation on solid rock. Emotional awareness in a family means recognizing that your children are not mirrors reflecting your own glory, nor are they tools to be leveraged for your own comfort or public image. They are independent ecosystems. When we fail to honor their individuality, we don't just alienate our children. We forfeit our right to be part of their futures. This is where the profound wisdom of Grandfather Theodore emerges as the ultimate lesson in long-term guidance. Theodore represented the true idealized core of traditional American values: hard work, stewardship, and a fierce, uncompromising honesty. He possessed the emotional intelligence to see straight through his son's expensive suits and his grandson's empty pitch decks. He saw the rot, and more importantly, he saw the quiet, enduring strength of the granddaughter who stood in the freezing rain to nurture the soil. Theodore's irrevocable trust was not merely a brilliant financial maneuver. It was a final, desperately loving act of parenting. He understood that true family responsibility sometimes means protecting your descendants from your own offspring. He used his wealth not to enable corruption, but to reward integrity. He recognized that leaving a legacy isn't about passing down money. It's about ensuring the resources end up in the hands of someone who knows how to plant, rather than someone who only knows how to consume. Think about the dinner tables in your own life. Think about the unspoken hierarchies, the subtle ways we signal to our children who is succeeding and who is falling behind. Are we praising the child who brings home the hollow trophy while ignoring the one who quietly helps a neighbor? Are we so terrified of losing our social standing that we are willing to sacrifice our children's moral compasses on the altar of public opinion? The modern family is under immense pressure to perform, to curate a flawless feed of achievements. But children are extraordinarily perceptive. They do not hear our lectures. They observe our choices. They see who we bail out and who we abandon. They see when our love is unconditional and when it is tied to a performance review. When Charles faked a cardiac episode in a sterile hospital room, attempting to use the sacred bond of family duty to extort his daughter, he demonstrated the ultimate perversion of the family structure. A traditional family is meant to be a fortress against the cruelties of the outside world, a sanctuary where honesty is the mortar and fairness is the stone. When parents weaponize that fortress, turning it into a trap, they sever the biological contract. Diana's refusal to sign that clipboard wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of profound self-preservation. It was the moment she became her own protector, stepping out of the toxic cycle and refusing to pass the poison down to the next generation. Stories like Diana's resonate deeply because they echo the silent, invisible battles fought behind the closed doors of so many homes. We all know a golden child. We all know a scapegoat. If this story struck a chord within you, if it made you pause and reflect on the roots you are watering in your own life, please take a moment to subscribe and follow Jessica Told Stories. We explore the profound, often hidden narratives that shape our lives, and your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful truths into the light. Ultimately, the story of the Timberland and the boardroom forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about family and love. We are conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, that loyalty is a debt we owe simply for being born, and that parental love is inherently pure and always constructive. But perhaps that is the grandest illusion of all. Conventional wisdom dictates that a parent's greatest duty is to give their child the world. But look at Nolan. Look at the wreckage of a life handed everything and taught nothing. The unconventional truth, the secret written in the rings of the ancient Oregon evergreens, is that sometimes the most profound act of love a parent can perform is to withhold, to allow the sting of failure, to refuse the bailout, to demand that a child build their own shelter before the rain falls, even if they hate you for it in the moment. And for the children, for the scapegoats who have spent their lives shivering in the cold shadows of conditional love, there is an equally jarring truth to embrace. We are told that forgiveness and reconciliation are the ultimate moral victories. We are told to keep the family whole at all costs. But walking away from the people who share your blood does not always make you an orphan. Sometimes it makes you a pioneer. True loyalty is not a suicide pact. Sometimes the only way to honor your family's true legacy is to let the corrupted branches snap so that the roots can finally breathe. Look at the soil beneath your own feet today. What are you growing? And more importantly, who are you willing to cut down to save it?